We are handing over the entire $2 billion to Brent. My father announced, his voice echoing coldly off the glass walls of the executive boardroom. And as for you, pack your things. You are fired, effective immediately. I stared at him, the air completely leaving my lungs as the betrayal set in. So you just sold my code? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the tense room. My mother chuckled, smoothing her expensive designer skirt with a dismissive wave of her hand. We sold our business, Gemma. Stop being so delusional and accept reality. The buyer, Donovan, the CEO of the massive pharmaceutical company that just wrote the massive check, suddenly stood up from his leather chair. Actually, he began looking quite uncomfortable with the family dynamic playing out. But my father swiftly cut him off, signaling the security guards waiting by the heavy doors. My name is Gemma, 33 years old, and until that moment, I was the lead computational biologist at my family firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your hard work stolen by the people who were supposed to protect you. The two burly security guards stepped forward immediately at my father Richard's command. They did not even give me a single chance to process what was happening. One of them grabbed my left arm, while the other stood uncomfortably close to my right side, treating me like a corporate spy, rather than the founding scientist of the entire company. I shrugged them off, maintaining my dignity as I walked out of the glass boardroom. The silence in the hallway was absolutely deafening. Dozens of employees, people I had trained and worked late nights with, suddenly found their shoes incredibly interesting. No one dared to make eye contact. Brent, my older brother by 2 years, followed closely behind me with a smug grin plastered across his face. He was wearing a custom Italian suit that cost more than my first car, paid for entirely by the company funds I had generated through my research. He clapped his hands together, a sharp and mocking sound that echoed in the open-plan office. "Let us get moving, genius," he sneered. "We have a massive company to hand over to Donovan today, and you are currently trespassing on Horizon Pharma property." I reached my small office. It was not even a corner suite. Despite creating the core artificial intelligence algorithm that predicted genetic mutations, the very algorithm that just sold for $2 billion, my parents had always insisted I stay in a modest workspace. They constantly claimed the corner offices were only for client-facing executives like Brent. Now, a cheap cardboard box sat squarely on my desk waiting for me. My mother, Patricia, strolled into the room right behind Brent. She looked pristine, her hair perfectly blown out, expensive diamonds resting at her throat. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me with an expression of pure disdain. "Do not take all day, Gemma," she snapped. "We have a celebration dinner booked at a Michelin star restaurant tonight, and we absolutely cannot be late just because you are dragging your feet." I picked up a framed photograph of my dog and placed it carefully into the box. "You are really doing this," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. After 7 long years. 7 years I spent down in the windowless basement of our old house writing that entire biological code from scratch. I built the predictive models while you two vacationed in Europe. I debugged the neural networks on weekends while Brent was out destroying company golf carts and expensing $1,000 bottles of champagne to the corporate account. Brent laughed out loud. He walked right up to my desk, snatched the employee identification badge right off my lanyard, and dropped it straight into the trash can. "You always were a dramatic little nerd," he said, leaning over my desk. "That is exactly why Mom and Dad run the business side, and you just push buttons on a keyboard. You seriously thought you owned any of this? You were just an employee, Gemma, an overpaid one at that." I looked at my mother, desperately searching for a shred of maternal instinct, a hint of guilt or remorse. There was absolutely nothing. She simply checked her expensive watch with a bored expression. "You were given a wonderful opportunity to work for the family," Patricia said smoothly. "But you always had this arrogant streak in you. You thought because you typed up some math equations you were suddenly the boss of us all. Your father and I took all the financial risks. We built the brand from nothing. Brent managed the critical client relationships. You were just the hired help who got a little too big for her boots. The sheer audacity of her words was staggering. They had taken zero financial risks. I had used my own meager savings to buy the initial computer servers. I had worked completely unpaid for the first 3 years while they drained the company accounts to fund their lavish Silicon Valley lifestyle. Brent had not managed a single client relationship. He just showed up to the final meetings to shake hands and take credit for the technical presentations I had meticulously prepared for him every single time. So $2 billion, I said, placing my favorite coffee mug into the cardboard box. And you are giving it all to the golden child who failed basic biology in college. He is the vice president of sales, my mother corrected sharply, her voice echoing down the hall for the remaining staff to hear. He is the face of this enterprise. He is a natural leader. You, on the other hand, have always lacked social grace and business acumen. We are simply righting a wrong today. We are ensuring the wealth goes to the child who actually knows how to carry the family legacy forward into the future. You should be thanking us for keeping you employed this long, considering your constant mental instability. Mental instability. That was the exact toxic phrase they always used to gaslight me whenever I demanded equity or fair compensation. If I asked for my rightful shares, I was acting crazy. If I complained about working 90-hour weeks while Brent went on luxurious ski trips, I was being hysterical. They had systematically isolated me, making sure I poured every ounce of my energy into the code while they secretly controlled the entire corporate structure behind my back. I closed the flaps of the cardboard box. The security guards stepped closer, ready to physically escort me out of the building. I looked at Brent, who was already adjusting his tie in the reflection of my office window, probably dreaming about the new mansion he was going to buy by the beach. Then I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me as if I were a pest that had finally been exterminated from her perfect life. I did not scream. I did not cry or beg for my job back. I simply picked up the box. "Enjoy your dinner," I said, walking right past them. As I rode the elevator down to the main lobby, flanked by the silent guards, I realized I did not even have my company car keys anymore. They had demanded them back yesterday under the guise of a routine fleet inventory check. They had planned this ambush perfectly. I stepped out into the damp California air, carrying my life in a cardboard box, completely stripped of my life work, my financial security, and my family. But as I began the long walk to the train station, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured a $2 billion fortune and successfully disposed of the only person who knew how the machinery actually worked. They had absolutely no idea what they had just unleashed. The public transit system of the Bay Area had never felt so painfully slow. I sat on the hard plastic seat of the train with the cardboard box resting heavily on my lap. The sharp edges of the box dug into my thighs, serving as a constant physical reminder of the humiliation I had just endured. Across from me, two young men in branded fleece vests were loudly discussing their latest seed funding round and startup valuations. Their arrogant laughter echoed in the train car, sounding exactly like my brother Brent. I stared blankly out the window as the sprawling tech campuses of Silicon Valley blurred past. Just an hour ago, I was the unseen architect of a $2 billion empire. Now, I was just another unemployed commuter holding a box of desk trinkets. I kept my breathing perfectly even. I refused to let the shock paralyze me. Panic was a useless emotion and inefficient variable that I always removed from my biological algorithms. My parents and my brother had meticulously orchestrated my execution. They had legally locked me out of the building, confiscated my company vehicle, and stripped me of my daily routine. But they could not strip me of my intellect. I simply needed to recalibrate my entire life strategy. I needed a secure environment to process the sheer magnitude of their theft. Most importantly, I needed my partner. My thoughts immediately turned to Lance. We had been engaged for exactly 8 months. Lance was a senior portfolio manager at a highly aggressive investment firm in the financial district. He was brilliant with numbers, ruthless with contracts, and understood the vicious corporate game better than anyone I knew. When I first told him about the artificial intelligence code I was developing for the family business, he was the one who encouraged me to work late nights. He always said we were building a foundation for our future marriage. He would rub my shoulders when I came home exhausted at 2 in the morning, promising me that the eventual payout would make all the dark circles under my eyes completely worth it. I pictured his face as the train screeched to a halt at my station. Lance would be absolutely furious on my behalf. He would instantly drop whatever financial portfolio he was analyzing. He would pour me a glass of the expensive red wine we kept saved for special occasions. Then he would sit down at our kitchen island, pull out his laptop, and start drafting a ruthless counterattack. He knew corporate lawyers. He knew how to leverage financial discrepancies. He would be my ultimate anchor in this sudden, devastating storm. The mere thought of his supportive embrace gave me the strength to carry the heavy box the remaining 6 blocks to our luxury apartment building. The doorman greeted me with his usual polite nod, though his eyes darted curiously to the cardboard box in my arms. I offered a tight, forced smile and stepped into the elevator. As the digital numbers climbed to our penthouse floor, I glanced down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring sparkled under the harsh elevator lights. It was a flawless stone, a symbol of the secure, predictable future I thought I had locked in. I took a deep, steadying breath as the elevator doors slid open. I walked down the carpeted hallway, silently rehearsing the words I would use to break the news to him. I did not want to sound hysterical. I wanted to present the facts logically so we could immediately shift into problem-solving mode. I pushed my key into the lock and turned the handle. I stepped inside expecting the usual pristine order of our shared living space. Lance was notoriously neat, insisting on a perfectly organized environment to match his structured financial mind. But the sight that greeted me made my boots freeze entirely on the hardwood floor. The apartment was in a state of absolute chaos. The closet doors down the hallway were thrown wide open. Expensive tailored shirts, silk ties, and dry cleaning bags were scattered haphazardly across the custom velvet sofa in the living room. The drawers of the entryway console table had been pulled out and left hanging, their contents rummaged through. For a brief, terrifying second, my analytical mind registered a home invasion. I almost dropped the box to call the police. But then I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps coming from our master bedroom. I walked slowly into the living room, the cardboard box suddenly feeling 100 times heavier in my arms. Right in the center of our expensive Persian rug sat an enormous piece of luggage. Lance was forcefully shoving his designer shoes and folded suits into the massive leather travel suitcase. His golf clubs were already piled by the front door next to a stack of his personal financial documents. He was not packing for a weekend business trip. He was evacuating the premises. "Lance," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence of the apartment. He jumped slightly, his broad shoulders tensing under his crisp dress shirt. He whipped around to face me. He did not look like a man happy to see his future wife. He did not rush over to take the heavy box from my aching arms. His eyes quickly darted from my face down to the cardboard box, registering the framed photo and the office supplies sticking out of the top. A dark, calculated look washed over his handsome features. It was the exact same cold, predatory expression he wore when he shorted a failing stock at his investment firm. There was no warmth in the room. The comforting hug I had desperately anticipated evaporated into the cold, sterile air. He stood up slowly, brushing a piece of lint off his trousers. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask why I was home in the middle of the workday holding my desk belongings. He just stared at me with an unsettling calmness that made my blood run instantly cold. The chaotic mess around the living room suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. The betrayal was not just confined to the glass walls of my family boardroom. It had followed me all the way home, waiting patiently in the very center of my supposed sanctuary. I set the heavy cardboard box down onto the cool marble surface of our kitchen island. The dull thud echoed loudly in the tense space between us. Lance did not flinch. He did not ask about my day. He did not offer a comforting word. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his tailored slacks and pulled out a small velvet box. He placed it precisely on the counter right next to the framed photograph of my dog. He flipped the lid open. My engagement ring sat inside, catching the overhead light, mocking my entire existence. "Brent called me," Lance said. His voice was completely devoid of any warmth or emotion. It was the exact same clinical tone he used when liquidating a dead corporate asset on the trading floor. He told me everything. $2 billion, Gemma. The company sold for $2 billion and you walked away with absolutely zero equity. You let them play you like a total amateur. I stared at the sparkling diamond, then slowly raised my eyes to look at the man I had planned to marry. They stole my code, Lance. My own parents threw me out of the building to hand the entire fortune to Brent. I thought you would understand. I thought we would fight them in court together. Lance let out a short, harsh laugh. He zipped up his massive leather duffel bag with a sharp, decisive pull. Fight them with what exactly? You have no money. You have no job. You do not even have a basic severance package. I am a portfolio manager, Gemma. I calculate risk and return for a living. You are currently the biggest financial liability in Silicon Valley. His words hit me, but they did not break me. My analytical mind simply categorized the information, updating my understanding of his true character. He had never loved me. He had only loved my proximity to a massive tech buyout. Brent made me a very lucrative offer. Lance continued, grabbing his heavy platinum watch from the side table and strapping it to his wrist. He needs someone competent to handle the massive transition of the sale funds. He offered me the chief financial officer position. 7 figures, exclusive stock options in his new holding company, and a massive signing bonus. And the only condition, I replied, my voice dropping to a glacial chill, was that you drop the dead weight. Lance smirked, adjusting his collar in the hallway mirror. Brent is a complete idiot, but he has the money now. I go where the capital flows. You should have been smarter. You spent 7 years writing a brilliant biological algorithm in a basement, but you never learned how to secure the bag in the real world. You are penniless, Gemma. I cannot build an empire with a woman who lets her own family walk all over her and take her life work for free. You are a failure. He grabbed the sturdy handle of his suitcase. The wheels rolled smoothly over the expensive Persian rug. He hoisted his heavy golf clubs onto his shoulder. He looked at me one last time, his gaze sweeping critically over my simple clothes and the sad cardboard box sitting on the counter. Good luck figuring out your next move. You are going to need it. I did not shed a single tear. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. The initial shock had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. My brain had already completely detached from the arrogant man standing in front of me. He was no longer my partner. He was just another hostile variable that needed to be neutralized immediately. I walked over to the far end of the kitchen counter where my personal laptop rested. I opened the screen. The blue glow illuminated my face as my fingers danced rapidly across the keyboard. I executed a specific sequence of commands, accessing a highly secure encrypted financial portal I had set up months ago for my personal business ventures. Lance paused at the front door, his hand resting heavily on the brass handle. He looked back clearly, expecting to see me crying, begging him to stay, or breaking down in hysterics. Instead, I hit the enter key with a satisfying click. "Drive safe, Lance," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the bright monitor. "By the way, you might want to call a cab. That brand new Porsche Brent promised to buy for you as a signing bonus is going to be a massive problem. He told you he was handling the down payment this morning, right?" Lance narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening defensively on his luggage. "What are you talking about?" I turned my head to meet his gaze. A cold, victorious smile spread across my lips. "Brent has terrible credit. He has been secretly using a corporate account to fund his lavish lifestyle. But that specific corporate account is tied directly to a limited liability company that I personally registered and control. I just reported the card stolen and flagged the dealership transaction as highly fraudulent." Lance went completely pale, his arrogant posture crumbling in an instant. "The dealership is repossessing the car right now," I concluded, my voice dropping to a deadly even whisper. "Enjoy the walk." The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment. I had not slept a single minute. Instead, I had spent the entire night analyzing the merger and acquisition documents between my family business and Horizon Pharma. I needed coffee before contacting my legal counsel. I walked down to the upscale espresso bar on the ground floor of my building. The barista, a young man who knew my usual order, handed me my black coffee. I tapped my primary platinum debit card against the payment terminal. A harsh beep broke the morning quiet. Declined. The barista frowned apologetically. He wiped the terminal screen and asked me to try again. I tapped the card a second time. Another sharp beep. Declined. I pulled out my backup credit card, a corporate account I had personally guaranteed. Declined. A cold knot formed in my stomach, not out of panic, but out of pure calculated realization. I stepped aside, allowing the customer behind me to pay, and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my private banking application. The loading screen spun for an unusually long time. When the dashboard finally materialized, a massive red banner glared back at me across the digital interface. Account frozen. Please contact your branch manager immediately regarding an active court order. I walked out onto the bustling San Francisco sidewalk. The cool morning air hit my face as I dialed the direct line to my wealth manager. He answered on the first ring, his voice trembling with an uncomfortable mix of professional courtesy and sheer panic. "Gemma," he started immediately. "I am so sorry. Our legal compliance department received an emergency injunction at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. We had absolutely no choice but to comply with a temporary asset freeze on all your personal and business accounts." I kept my voice completely level. "On what grounds did a judge sign off on an emergency injunction without notifying me first?" He swallowed hard. "Your father, acting as the chief executive officer of the company, filed an expedited corporate espionage claim late last night. The legal filing alleges that you removed highly sensitive proprietary company property from the premises. They are claiming that cardboard box you carried out contained encrypted hard drives loaded with the $2 billion artificial intelligence algorithm. The judge granted a temporary freeze on your assets to prevent you from fleeing the jurisdiction or selling the allegedly stolen data to foreign competitors." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Richard had weaponized the legal system against his own daughter overnight. He knew perfectly well there were no hard drives in that box. He knew security had watched my every single move. This was not a legal strategy. This was a siege tactic. They wanted to starve me out. They wanted to cut off my access to legal representation by draining my financial resources in a matter of hours. "Thank you for the update," I told my wealth manager. "Do not process any further requests from my family without my explicit verbal authorization." I ended the call and slipped my phone into my pocket. Almost immediately, the device vibrated violently against my hip. The caller identification displayed my father. I let it ring 3 times, controlling the pace of the interaction, before I hit the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Good morning, Gemma," Richard said. His voice was smooth, dripping with the fake paternal benevolence he always used right before crushing a business rival. "I assume you have tried to buy your morning coffee by now." I stared at the busy intersection in front of me, watching the traffic flow with mathematical precision. "You filed a fraudulent claim with a federal judge," I stated factually. "You and I both know that box contained nothing but a framed photo and a coffee mug. Perjury is a dangerous game to play when you are in the middle of a $2 billion corporate handover." My father laughed, a dark, rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. "Prove it," he challenged confidently. "We have the best corporate lawyers in the state on our payroll. You currently have $0 to hire a defense attorney. We can drag this out in civil court for years. We will drain you until you are sleeping on the street." I remained entirely silent, letting his threats hang in the empty air. My silence always unnerved him. It meant I was analyzing him, and he hated being analyzed. "Listen to me very carefully." Richard continued, his tone shifting from amused to aggressively commanding. "Your mother and I are willing to be reasonable. We understand you threw a tantrum yesterday because you felt left out of the financial windfall. We are willing to drop the lawsuit. We are willing to unfreeze your accounts. But you have to earn your way back into this family." I leaned against the brick wall of my apartment building. "And what exactly does earning my way back entail?" A heavy sigh came through the receiver. You need to learn respect. We are hosting a private celebration party at the estate this evening. The top tier of Silicon Valley will be there. Investors, developers, and the board members of Horizon Pharma. I want you to walk through those front doors. I want you to stand in front of me, your mother, and your brother Brent. You will drop to your knees in front of our guests, and you will publicly apologize for your insubordination. You will admit that your erratic behavior caused your termination. If you can humble yourself and show true remorse, I will transfer $50,000 into your account tomorrow morning so you can start over somewhere else. He was trying to break my spirit entirely. He wanted a public spectacle to solidify their narrative that I was just a hysterical, ungrateful child who contributed nothing of value to the company. $50,000. It was an insulting crumb meant to secure my permanent submission while they walked away with billions. They thought they had trapped me in an inescapable financial corner. They thought my entire existence depended on the funds they had just locked away. But my parents had made one fatal miscalculation in their aggressive strategy. They assumed I was as careless with my assets as Brent was with his. They assumed the money they froze was my only lifeline. I will not be attending any apologies, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. You are making a massive mistake, he growled, the facade of the caring father vanishing instantly. You have until tonight. If you do not show up and grovel, I will make sure you never work in the biotechnology sector again. I will crush you. I ended the call without another word. The threat was empty noise. I did not need his money to survive the week. I did not need his permission to work in the industry. I only needed my intellect and my legal counsel. I hailed a taxi, paying the driver with a crisp $100 bill I kept hidden in the lining of my designer coat for emergencies exactly like this one. Take me to the downtown legal district, I instructed the driver. I had a meeting to schedule with Sylvia, the most ruthless intellectual property lawyer on the West Coast. The financial blockade was a minor inconvenience. The real war was about to begin. I spent the entire afternoon in the secure conference room of my intellectual property lawyer. Sylvia and I mapped out every possible legal contingency and locked down the hidden corporate structures I had established years ago. By the time I returned to my apartment building, a courier had left a heavy gold-embossed envelope with the concierge. It was an official invitation to the $2 billion victory gala being held at my parents' private estate in Atherton. Patricia was not extending an olive branch. She was summoning me to my own public execution. She wanted me to witness the empire she had stolen, and she wanted to ensure the entire tech industry saw me broken and defeated. Since Richard had successfully frozen my bank accounts and confiscated my company vehicle, paying for a premium ride service was entirely out of the question. I refused to touch my emergency cash reserves for a trivial luxury. Instead, I put on my sharpest black designer dress, slipped into a pair of impeccable heels, and took the commuter train as far as it would go. From the station, I walked the remaining 2 miles up the steep, winding roads of the exclusive neighborhood. Luxury vehicles, sleek black town cars, and expensive sports cars zipped past me in the fading evening light. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my breathing deeply controlled. The physical exertion sharpened my focus. By the time I reached the massive wrought iron gates of my childhood home, I was not exhausted. I was highly energized and ready for war. The mansion was completely transformed for the evening. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to park an endless stream of expensive cars. String musicians played a sophisticated arrangement on the sprawling front lawn, and the entire property was bathed in dramatic theatrical lighting. Waiters circulated with silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and imported caviar. This was not just a celebration of a corporate buyout. It was a royal coronation for my brother Brent. I bypassed the crowded main entrance and walked confidently through the side terrace doors. The grand ballroom was packed with the most influential figures in Silicon Valley. I recognized venture capitalists, prominent tech journalists, board members of rival firms, and several senior executives from Horizon Pharma. These were the exact people who controlled the flow of capital, reputation, and opportunity in the biotechnology sector. My parents had gathered the perfect audience needed to permanently blackball me from the industry. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a massive floral arrangement, silently observing the room dynamics. It did not take long to notice the highly coordinated whispering. As I moved slowly through the crowd, conversations abruptly halted. Executives who had praised my genetic research just a month ago suddenly found urgent reasons to look the other way. The social freeze was absolute and incredibly calculated. I tracked the epicenter of this toxic rumor mill directly to my mother. Patricia was holding court near the grand marble fireplace, surrounded by a group of key industry investors, and Donovan, the chief executive officer of Horizon Pharma. She wore a stunning emerald gown and a deeply tragic, entirely fabricated expression of maternal sorrow. I stepped closer, remaining just outside her peripheral vision, and listened to the poison she was actively injecting into my professional network. It has been an incredibly difficult year for the family. Patricia sighed, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. We tried absolutely everything to help Gemma. We paid for the best therapists and gave her unlimited time off, but her mental state just continued to deteriorate. The pressure of the biotechnology sector is simply too much for fragile minds to handle. Donovan looked genuinely concerned by this revelation. I had no idea she was struggling with clinical psychiatric issues. Her data models during the initial pitch were always so precise and groundbreaking. Patricia shook her head sadly, dabbing at a non-existent tear. The models were largely Brent's conceptual work. Gemma just handled the basic data entry and routine coding. Unfortunately, her delusions grew out of control. She started hallucinating that she owned the entire company and invented the algorithm herself. We had to let her go for her own safety and the safety of the merger. We are hoping this financial cutoff forces her to finally seek the psychiatric help she desperately needs. The absolute flawless delivery of her lie was staggering. She was systematically destroying my professional credibility, labeling me as an unstable, delusional data entry clerk. In Silicon Valley, being labeled a psychiatric liability was a total career death sentence. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement and walked directly into the center of their exclusive circle. The temperature in the group dropped instantly. Patricia froze her champagne glass, hovering inches from her lips. "Good evening, Mother," I said. My voice was perfectly modulated, completely calm and carrying just enough volume to turn heads across the room. "I apologize for missing the start of your fictional storytelling session. I had to walk here as Father illegally seized my vehicle this morning under false pretenses." The investors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. Donovan looked completely bewildered by the sudden sharp tension. Patricia recovered quickly, shifting seamlessly into her fake maternal concern mode. "Gemma, sweetheart, you really should not be here. You are clearly having another severe episode. We can call a doctor for you right now to get you some help." I smiled, a sharp, cold expression that made her flinch visibly. "I am perfectly healthy, Patricia. My cognitive functions are operating at maximum efficiency. I am simply here to congratulate Donovan on purchasing an incredibly expensive shell company." Donovan frowned, stepping forward with intense curiosity. "What do you mean by a shell company?" Patricia laughed shrilly, reaching out to grab Donovan's arm in a panic. "Do not listen to her, Donovan. I told you she has these paranoid delusions. Security will escort her out immediately." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact with the CEO of Horizon Pharma. I just looked at him with absolute analytical certainty. A wise investor always verifies the source code before clearing a $2 billion check, Donovan. "I suggest you have your technical team run a deep diagnostic on the primary servers tomorrow morning. You might find the architecture a little lacking without the original builder." Donovan narrowed his eyes, clearly unsettled by my direct challenge. Before he could formulate a follow-up question regarding the source code, a heavy, aggressively manicured hand clamped down hard on my left shoulder. The overwhelming stench of a commercial designer cologne and expensive vintage alcohol hit my senses a fraction of a second before I heard his voice. "Gemma! There you are!" Brent boomed, projecting his voice loudly enough for the surrounding cluster of venture capitalists to hear. "We have been looking absolutely everywhere for you." His fingers dug painfully into my collarbone, a silent physical threat masked as brotherly affection. He stepped seamlessly between Donovan and me, using his broad shoulders to physically cut me off from the chief executive of Horizon Pharma. Brent flashed his signature empty charismatic smile at the bewildered executive. "You have to excuse us, Donovan." My brother laughed smoothly. "My little sister forgot to take her medication today. Family matters, you completely understand. I will have security help her find her way back home safely." I did not struggle against his grip. Fighting him physically in the middle of a corporate gala would only validate their narrative that I was hysterical and out of control. I allowed him to steer me away from the center of the room, analyzing his elevated heart rate and the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. He was absolutely terrified. My mere presence had disrupted their flawless victory lap, and he was desperate to neutralize the threat. Brent forcefully guided me toward the far-shadowed edge of the grand ballroom, right next to a towering, intricate ice sculpture of the company logo. We were out of direct earshot of the primary investors, but we were still highly visible to the entire room. He finally released my shoulder, grabbing a massive crystal goblet filled to the brim with a dark, heavy Cabernet from a passing waiter's silver tray. "You really do not know when to quit, do you?" Brent hissed, dropping the fake smile the instant our backs were to the crowd. His eyes were wide with a manic, greedy energy. "You just could not sit in your miserable little apartment and accept defeat. You had to drag yourself all the way up this hill to ruin my night." I looked at him with complete clinical detachment. "I did not ruin anything, Brent. I simply offered Donovan a piece of standard technical advice. If your product works exactly the way you promised him it does, you have absolutely nothing to worry about." A muscle in his jaw twitched violently. He took a large gulp of the red wine, his hand shaking ever so slightly. "The product works fine," he spat back. "And it belongs to me now. It belongs to the family. You spent 7 years acting like you were some kind of irreplaceable genius, but you are nothing. You are a socially awkward, unlikable data cruncher who got lucky with a few lines of math. I am the one who sold this vision. I am the one who charmed the board. I am the one walking away with $1 billion trust fund." I maintained my steady, unblinking gaze. "You could not even write a basic sorting algorithm if your life depended on it," I stated factually. "You are going to burn through that money before you even understand how the capital gains taxes work." His face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The truth always infuriated him because he possessed zero intellectual capacity to argue against it. He looked me up and down, his eyes locking onto the pristine, expensive white designer dress I had chosen specifically for this occasion. A dark, vicious realization settled over his features. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, holding the crystal goblet of wine directly over my chest. "Let me explain the natural order of the universe to you, Gemma," he whispered, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "I am the star of this legacy. I am the face of this entire empire. You were born just to be a background for me. You are nothing but the grease in the gears of my success. Remember your place." With a deliberate, sharp flick of his wrist, Brent tipped the heavy crystal goblet forward. A massive wave of dark red Cabernet cascaded downward, hitting my collar and splashing violently across the front of my crisp white silk dress. The cold liquid soaked instantly through the expensive fabric, clinging to my skin and spreading like a massive, undeniable bloodstain across my chest. A collective sharp gasp echoed from the nearest group of guests. The surrounding conversations died instantly as people turned to stare at the commotion. Brent immediately threw his hands up in the air, widening his eyes in a theatrical display of horror. "Oh my God, Gemma, I am so incredibly sorry," he shouted, making sure his voice carried across the silent ballroom. "My hand just completely slipped. Let me get you a towel. You must be so embarrassed." He reached out, pretending to help, but I calmly took a half step back, avoiding his touch entirely. I looked down at the ruined silk, feeling the cold, sticky wine dripping down my skin. Then I slowly raised my head and looked directly into my brother's eyes. I did not scream. I did not burst into tears. I did not raise my hand to strike him. I simply stood there dripping in his pathetic attempt at humiliation, and I smiled. It was not a forced smile. It was a genuine, terrifying expression of absolute certainty. It was the smile of an apex predator looking at a mouse that had just eagerly walked into a steel trap. Brent's fake apology faltered instantly. The smug satisfaction drained completely from his face, replaced by a sudden chilling confusion. He took a hesitant step back, deeply unnerved by my complete lack of emotional distress. He expected me to shatter. Instead, I was radiating an icy, untouchable power. I turned my back on him. The crowd of Silicon Valley elites instinctively parted for me, creating a wide, clear path to the exit. No one whispered. No one moved. Patricia suddenly broke from the crowd, rushing forward with a linen napkin, playing the role of the frantically concerned mother. "Oh, Gemma, darling, let me help you clean that up," she cried out. I did not break my stride. I stepped effortlessly around her outstretched hands without acknowledging her existence. I walked with my head held high, my posture immaculate, carrying the dark red stain like a medal of honor rather than a mark of shame. I pushed open the massive mahogany front doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool California night. The heavy doors closed silently behind me, cutting off the suffocating atmosphere of the gala. I walked down the sweeping, illuminated driveway, the cold wind hitting my soaked dress, but I felt absolutely nothing but a soaring electric focus. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my smartphone. I dialed my intellectual property lawyer. Sylvia answered on the very first ring. "Are you safely off the property?" she asked, her voice sharp and ready. "I am completely clear of the perimeter," I replied, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. And they took the bait flawlessly. They are blinded by their own arrogance. I could hear the satisfying clack of a keyboard on her end of the line. "Give me the word, Gemma." I looked up at the clear night sky, a deep sense of absolute peace settling over my analytical mind. "Activate the Omega Protocol," I commanded, my voice cutting sharply through the quiet night. They think they just finalized the sale of the predictive artificial intelligence algorithm, but they have absolutely no idea that they only sold a completely empty, useless interface. The sterile temperature-controlled server room at Horizon Pharma headquarters hummed with the quiet, continuous power of a multi-million-dollar computing cluster. Donovan stood with his arms crossed tightly over his tailored suit, his sharp eyes locked onto the massive digital displays mounted across the reinforced glass walls. This was the exact moment the highly publicized $2 billion acquisition transitioned from signed legal paperwork into a tangible corporate asset. The due diligence period was officially over. It was time to integrate the most advanced biological algorithm in the world into the Horizon Pharma infrastructure. Dr. Caldwell, the highly respected Chief Technology Officer of Horizon, sat at the primary command console. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced precision. A team of 6 senior software engineers stood behind him, monitoring the secure data transfer from the encrypted hard drives that Richard and Brent had personally delivered to the executive suite earlier that morning. The atmosphere in the room was thick with intense anticipation. Donovan had staked his entire professional reputation on this specific merger. He had convinced his demanding board of directors that acquiring this specific genetic prediction technology would position Horizon Pharma a full decade ahead of their fiercest competitors. He remembered Brent standing in the boardroom during the final pitch, flashing that bright, charismatic smile promising seamless integration and unparalleled data processing speeds. "We have successfully bypassed the initial security firewalls," Dr. Caldwell announced, his voice carrying a note of professional satisfaction. "The core interface is loading onto our primary servers now. The file architecture looks incredibly sophisticated." Donovan nodded slowly, a tight smile forming on his lips. "Boot it up," he commanded. "Let us see exactly what $2 billion buys us today." The massive screens at the front of the room flickered to life. A beautifully designed, sleek graphic user interface materialized in crisp, high definition. It was the exact same pristine dashboard Brent had showcased during his numerous investor presentations. The layout was incredibly intuitive, displaying complex biological modeling parameters with elegant simplicity. Donovan felt a profound surge of vindication. The technology was real, and it now belonged entirely to him. Run the first batch of oncology genomic sequences, Donovan instructed, stepping closer to the glass partition. Use the historical data from our lung cancer trials. I want to see the predictive mutation timeline generated in real time. Dr. Caldwell nodded, his eyes fixed intently on his monitor. He imported the massive data set into the newly installed system and clicked the execution command. A sleek loading bar appeared in the center of the main display screen. It glowed a vibrant, promising blue. The room fell completely silent save for the rhythmic humming of the massive cooling fans, keeping the server racks at optimal temperatures. Everyone held their breath, waiting to witness a revolutionary leap in medical technology. The progress bar reached exactly 12%. Then it completely froze. The vibrant blue color instantly shifted to a harsh, blinding red. A sharp, discordant warning tone blared from the diagnostic speakers, shattering the quiet anticipation of the laboratory. Donovan frowned, his posture instantly rigid. What just happened? Did we overload the processing capacity? Dr. Caldwell leaned closer to his monitor, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. No. The computing cluster is operating at less than 5% capacity. The system simply halted the execution sequence. I am pulling up the back-end diagnostic logs right now. The large display screen flashed violently. The elegant graphic interface vanished entirely, replaced by a stark black command prompt window. A single line of bold red text blinked aggressively in the center of the screen. Fatal error. Kernel access denied. Commercial license expired. Fix it. Donovan snapped, his voice dropping to a dangerous, demanding register. We own the proprietary rights to this software entirely. Bypass the administrative lock. Dr. Caldwell's fingers hammered frantically across his keyboard. He opened multiple diagnostic windows, his eyes darting rapidly across streams of scrolling code. The confident posture he had held just moments ago completely evaporated. A cold sweat began to form along his hairline. He typed another sequence of commands, attempting to force the system to recognize their administrative credentials. The screen flashed again. Authentication failed. Revocable license terminated by primary architect. Donovan stepped directly behind his chief technology officer, his presence looming like a dark cloud. I do not pay you to read error messages, Caldwell. I pay you to integrate the asset. Where is the core algorithm? Dr. Caldwell slowly turned around in his chair. His face was entirely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had just watched a ghost walk through the server room walls. Donovan. Dr. Caldwell started, his voice barely a raspy whisper. The core algorithm is not on these hard drives. What do you mean it is not on the drives? Donovan demanded, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. Richard and Brent handed those drives directly to our legal team. We verified the file sizes during the initial audit. The file sizes match the audit because the drives are packed with dense, highly complex encrypted routing protocols. Caldwell explained, his hands visibly shaking as he pointed to the scrolling data on his monitor. They sold us a beautifully constructed hollow shell. The interface we just looked at is nothing but a localized visual wrapper. It does not actually process any genetic data at all. Whenever Brent ran a simulation during the pitch meetings, the interface was silently sending an external application, programming interface call to a remote, highly secure server, located somewhere completely outside this building. Caldwell continued, swallowing hard. The actual neural network, the artificial intelligence that performs the complex biological calculations, lives entirely on that external server. We never bought the machine. We only bought a temporary digital key to access the machine. And the key? Donovan asked, his voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. Dr. Caldwell looked back at the glaring red error message on the main screen. The digital key was tied to a highly specific conditional commercial license. According to the architecture logs I am seeing right here, That license was permanently revoked and manually destroyed from the host server exactly 48 hours ago. The connection is completely severed. We have absolutely zero access to the predictive models. The sterile laboratory fell into a suffocating absolute silence. The magnitude of the deception hit Donovan with the force of a physical blow. Richard and Brent had stood in his pristine boardroom, shaken his hand, and confidently accepted a $2 billion payout for a hollow piece of software they did not even truly control. They had sold Horizon Pharma an empty box with a pretty ribbon tied around it. Donovan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his analytical mind rapidly calculating the catastrophic fallout. The press release had already been distributed to major financial news outlets. The board of directors had already celebrated the acquisition. Horizon Pharma stock had already surged based on the promise of this specific technology. If the market discovered they had just spent $2 billion on a dead, useless interface, the corporate stock would plummet instantly and the board would demand his immediate resignation. He had been played for an absolute fool by a family of arrogant, incompetent frauds. "Get my legal team on a secure conference line immediately," Donovan ordered, turning sharply toward the heavy laboratory doors. His voice was no longer that of a composed corporate executive. It was the voice of a man preparing to burn an entire empire to the ground. "Find out exactly who holds the registration for the remote server. I want Richard and Brent dragged into my office before the end of the hour. If they do not produce the actual source code today, I will personally ensure they spend the rest of their miserable lives in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud." I sat across from Sylvia in her pristine high-security office, overlooking the financial district. Sylvia slid a thick, heavy leather-bound folder across the polished mahogany desk. The gold-embossed lettering on the cover caught the morning light perfectly. It read, "Nemesis Tech Limited Liability Company." Sylvia poured 2 glasses of aged scotch, pushing one toward me. "A toast to absolute foresight," she said, her sharp eyes gleaming with professional triumph. I took the glass, allowing my mind to drift back 7 years. I remembered sitting in the damp, windowless basement of my parents' old house, surrounded by humming, cooling fans and empty coffee cups. Even back then, long before the $2 billion valuation, I knew exactly who my father was. I knew Richard would eventually try to steal my life work and hand it directly to his golden child on a silver platter. He had spent his entire life favoring Brent, throwing money at my brother's endless failures while demanding my silent, unpaid labor. I knew that the moment my artificial intelligence algorithm became profitable, they would try to erase me from the narrative entirely. So before I ever allowed my family business to access a single line of my genetic prediction code, I protected myself. I hired Sylvia with my own carefully hoarded savings. Together we quietly registered the entire source code, the complex neural network architecture, and the predictive mutation algorithms under a highly shielded corporate entity based in Delaware. We named it Nemesis Tech. My parents' company never actually owned the digital asset. They only signed a standard commercial software as a service agreement. It was in purely legal terms, nothing more than a monthly rental contract. Sylvia opened the master contract, tapping her perfectly manicured finger on page 42. Section 4, paragraph B. She read aloud, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "The commercial license granted to the licensee is entirely contingent upon the continuous voluntary employment of the primary architect. In the event of involuntary termination, physical removal from the premises, or hostile corporate restructuring, said license is immediately, irrevocably, and automatically terminated." I smiled, taking a slow sip of the scotch. The memory of Richard signing that exact document 7 years ago played vividly in my mind. He had been far too arrogant and impatient to read the fine print. He had looked at the thick stack of legal jargon, rolled his eyes at my demand for formal paperwork, and simply scrawled his signature on the final page. He automatically assumed his quiet, compliant daughter would never possess the ruthless, strategic capacity to draft a defensive kill switch against him. He truly believed he owned me. He never realized I owned the entire foundation of his soon-to-be empire. Meanwhile, across the city, The executive conference room at Horizon Pharma was rapidly descending into an absolute, unmitigated disaster. Donovan threw a heavy glass water pitcher directly against the wall. The thick glass shattered violently, sending water spraying across the expensive corporate carpet. His elite team of corporate attorneys frantically reviewed the digital contracts they had just acquired from Richard and Brent. The lead counsel, a sharp man in a gray suit, pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. He was sweating profusely. Sir, the lead counsel stammered, his hands visibly trembling as he held up a printed copy of the original software licensing agreement. We have a catastrophic problem on our hands. We did not buy the algorithm. We bought a corporate entity that was merely renting the algorithm. And as of yesterday morning, their rental agreement was completely voided by the rightful owner. Donovan slammed both his hands down on the massive conference table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. How is that even legally possible? He roared. We audited their entire intellectual property portfolio for 6 months. Brent explicitly guaranteed us in writing that they held the master copyright for the genetic software. The lead counsel swallowed hard, shuffling the papers frantically. Brent blatantly lied, or he was simply too incompetent and arrogant to understand the actual back-end structure of his own family business. The master copyright belongs entirely to a private holding firm called Nemesis Tech. Our newly acquired company was functioning strictly on a revocable commercial license, and the primary architect of that license just triggered an absolute irreversible kill switch. Donovan felt the blood drain completely from his face. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a freight train. Richard and Brent had stood right there in his office, looked him directly in the eyes, and signed a multi-billion-dollar acquisition agreement for a digital asset they had absolutely zero legal right to sell. They had not just exaggerated their capabilities, they had committed corporate fraud on an unprecedented federal scale. Who controls Nemesis Tech? Donovan demanded, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. Find the registered owner right now. We buy them out directly. We cut Richard and Brent out of the equation entirely. The lead counsel typed furiously into his secure terminal, accessing the Federal Business Registry database. The holding company is heavily shielded, he reported, his eyes scanning the rapidly decoding data. It is registered through a proxy legal firm, but the primary architect, the only individual with the authorized administrative clearance to negotiate the license, is listed right here. Donovan leaned over the polished table. His jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. Give me the name. The lead counsel looked up, his expression a mixture of profound shock and deep, unsettling dread. It is Gemma, the woman they had security physically escort out of the building yesterday afternoon. The woman Patricia claimed was suffering from a severe psychiatric breakdown. Donovan stood perfectly still. The puzzle pieces snapped together with brutal, crystal clarity. Patricia had not been trying to protect the merger from a delusional, hysterical employee. She had been desperately trying to discredit the true mastermind before Horizon Pharma discovered the massive, undeniable deception. The entire family had conspired to steal the massive payout, completely unaware that Gemma held the only functional key to the empire. They had essentially sold a stolen vehicle to the most powerful pharmaceutical chief executive in the country, and the original owner had just remotely killed the engine. Get my security team in here immediately, Donovan commanded, striding toward the heavy wooden doors with lethal purpose. Lock down the entire building. Do not let Richard or Brent leave the premises under any circumstances. If they try to run, hold them physically until federal authorities arrive. They just attempted to defraud Horizon Pharma of $2 billion. I'm going to absolutely destroy them. Back in Sylvia's office, my smartphone vibrated aggressively against the mahogany desk. I glanced down at the glowing screen. I had 47 missed calls from my father, 29 from my mother, and 56 frantic text messages from Brent. The sheer panic was palpable through the digital notifications. The false bravado they displayed at the gala had completely evaporated. The horrifying realization of their colossal, fatal mistake was finally settling in. Sylvia swirled the amber liquid in her glass, watching the phone screen light up with yet another incoming call from Richard. They are drowning, she noted clinically, a cold smile playing on her lips. I picked up my phone and slid the device into my pocket without answering a single call. Let them sink, I replied, my voice carrying absolutely zero sympathy. They spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable, worthless asset. It is finally time they learn the actual devastating cost of doing business. Richard paced the length of his massive home office, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the imported rug. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sharp, jagged sound of his breathing. Patricia sat rigidly on the velvet sofa, her face entirely drained of color. Brent stood by the window, nervously chewing on his thumbnail. The speakerphone on the mahogany desk had just disconnected, but Donovan's final words still hung in the air, like a physical weight around their necks. Donovan had not yelled. He had spoken with the chilling, calculated precision of an executioner reading a death sentence. He gave them exactly 48 hours. If the artificial intelligence network was not fully operational and legally transferred to Horizon Pharma within that precise time frame, Donovan promised to hand over every single fraudulent contract to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He made it completely clear that he would not just sue them for financial damages. He would ensure they all served maximum sentences in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and corporate deception. How could you not know? Richard suddenly roared, slamming his fist down on the heavy wooden desk. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his golden child. You told me you audited her work. You looked me right in the eyes and said you had total control of the system. Brent backed away from the window, raising his hands defensively. I did control the system, Brent argued, his voice pitching upward in panic. I had all the administrative passwords. The interface was working perfectly yesterday morning when we ran the simulation for the board. How was I supposed to know the little freak had a remote kill switch buried deep inside the back-end architecture? I am a sales executive, not a computer programmer. Patricia pressed her hands against her temples, trying to stop the room from spinning. We are going to lose everything, she whispered, her voice cracking under the sheer terror of impending poverty. The mansion, the country club memberships, the offshore accounts, it will all vanish. Donovan will freeze our assets before the sun goes down tomorrow. The government will seize this house and auction off everything we own. We are not losing anything, Richard snapped, though the sweat pouring down his face betrayed his escalating panic. We just need to force her to turn the machine back on. We call her, we offer her the old job back with a small raise, and we tell her this was all a massive misunderstanding. She is family. She will cave. She always caves when we apply enough pressure. Brent pulled out his smartphone, his fingers slipping nervously on the glass screen. He hit the speed dial for his sister. The phone rang, the mechanical sound echoing loudly in the silent office. It rang again and again. It went straight to a generic voicemail box. Pick up the phone, Gemma, Brent yelled into the receiver, pacing rapidly across the room. This is not funny anymore. You made your point. Dad is willing to negotiate your severance package and give you a promotion. Call me back immediately. He ended the call and dialed again. Sent directly to voicemail. She is ignoring me, Brent said, staring at his screen in disbelief. Patricia snatched her own phone from her designer handbag. Let me try, she demanded, her perfectly manicured fingers shaking uncontrollably. She dialed the number and waited with bated breath. Gemma, sweetheart, it is Mom. We are so worried about you. Please pick up the phone. We know you are upset about how things were handled yesterday, but we are a family. Families fight, but we always forgive each other in the end. We need you to come back to the office right now. We have a very special bonus waiting for you. Nothing. No response. The digital silence was absolutely deafening. Richard ripped his phone from his pocket, abandoning any pretense of paternal warmth. He left a message that was pure, desperate rage. You listen to me right now. You are going to log into that server, and you are going to restore the access keys. If you do not fix this within the next hour, I am going to make sure you spend the rest of your life paying for the damages. You hear me? Call me back immediately. Call me. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. The sun began to set over their sprawling estate, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. The luxurious life they had built on the foundation of my unpaid labor was rapidly crumbling before their very eyes. Brent threw his phone against the wall in a fit of absolute despair. The device shattered into a dozen pieces, much like their fraudulent corporate strategy. She blocked us, Brent gasped, sinking onto the sofa next to our mother. She blocked every single one of our numbers. I cannot reach her through email, and her personal social media accounts are completely deactivated. Patricia covered her face with her hands, a harsh sob escaping her throat. She planned this. Patricia cried, the horrifying realization finally taking root in her mind. She knew exactly what we were going to do to her, and she laid a trap for us. We walked right into it blindly. Richard stared blankly at the wall, the blood completely drained from his face. For the first time in his arrogant, ruthless life, he was utterly powerless. He had sold a $2 billion ghost to the most dangerous man in the pharmaceutical industry. He had 36 hours left on the clock before the federal agents would kick his front door down. "We have to go to her apartment," Richard commanded, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated fear. "We drive there right now, and we do not leave until she gives us the code. Whatever she demands, we give it to her. We have absolutely no other choice. We are completely at her absolute mercy." My apartment was a fortified command center of absolute digital supremacy. 6 curved, ultra-high-definition monitors illuminated the darkened room with a constant cascading stream of encrypted data. The low, steady hum of my custom-built processing units provided a comforting rhythm, masking the sounds of the bustling city streets far below. I stood in the center of the expansive living space, breathing in the rich, earthy aroma of the dark roast espresso brewing in the kitchen. Outside my reinforced windows, the San Francisco skyline glittered with the cold, bright lights of 1,000 tech companies. Inside, I was the sole, undisputed sovereign of my own biological algorithm empire. I walked over to the sleek kitchen island and poured the steaming black coffee into my ceramic mug. The heat radiated deeply through my palms, grounding me in the present moment. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter caffeine sharpen my already heightened senses. Moving back to my primary command station, I settled into my ergonomic leather chair. The central monitor displayed a live, real-time feed of the authentication logs from the Nemesis tech servers. It was an absolute masterpiece of pathetic corporate desperation. For the past 3 hours, I had been monitoring a relentless sequence of failed login attempts. The originating Internet Protocol addresses belonged entirely to the executive suite at Horizon Pharma and the secure private network of my parents' sprawling estate. Richard and Brent were commanding their highly paid information technology teams to brute force their way into my architecture. They were throwing every single cyber weapon they possessed at my firewall. It was exactly like watching toddlers trying to break into a titanium bank vault with plastic spoons. They lacked the foundational mathematical comprehension of the cryptographic keys I had personally engineered. They were entirely locked out, and the structural walls of their stolen empire were closing in on them rapidly. I shifted my analytical gaze to my smartphone resting silently on the edge of the desk. It had been completely dead since I initiated the global communication block on their personal numbers. The isolation was a necessary tactical maneuver to establish total dominance over the situation. But now the timing was strategically optimal to let them peek over the precipice of the abyss they had eagerly dug for themselves. They needed to understand the exact devastating nature of the trap they had triggered. I picked up the device and navigated smoothly to my contact settings. With a single decisive tap, I removed the digital restriction on Brent's specific cellular number. I placed the phone back down on the desk and waited. I knew his psychological profile flawlessly. He was a creature of absolute impulse driven entirely by unrestrained ego and a lifelong lack of consequences. He would be redialing and messaging constantly, desperately hoping for a crack in my defenses. It took less than 40 seconds. The smartphone vibrated violently against the hard desk surface. The screen lit up instantly with a massive barrage of incoming text messages. They flooded the display in rapid succession, a pure digital manifestation of his complete mental breakdown. I did not pick up the device immediately. I let it vibrate, watching the notifications stack up one by one. Finally, I reached out and opened the encrypted message thread. The progression of his texts was a textbook study in clinical narcissism colliding head-on with catastrophic failure. The first message read, "Gemma, you need to turn the servers back on right now. Dad is absolutely furious. Donovan is threatening to cancel the entire deal and sue us into oblivion. Stop playing these childish games before you ruin everything we worked for." I took another sip of my hot coffee. We worked for. The sheer blinding audacity was almost highly entertaining. I scrolled down smoothly to the next block of frantic text. "Gemma, answer me right now. We are willing to negotiate terms. Dad said he will double your severance package immediately. He will wire you $100,000 today if you just send the administrative passwords to my email. We can put all this behind us. You are destroying the family legacy over a petty grudge. $100,000. They were offering me a microscopic, insulting fraction of the $2 billion they had just attempted to steal from my intellectual property. They still genuinely believed they could purchase my silent submission with the spare change from their couch cushions. They still viewed me as the obedient, desperate girl trapped in the basement begging for scraps of validation. The final message, sent just moments after I unblocked his number, abandoned all pathetic pretense of corporate negotiation. The rising panic had morphed entirely into pure, unadulterated venom. It was the desperate, aggressive thrashing of a man who realized his golden parachute was actually an anvil strapped directly to his chest. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little thief," Brent wrote his words, practically screaming off the illuminated screen. "I have the best corporate security team in the state tracing your location right now. You stole highly sensitive company data. I am calling the San Francisco Police Department. I am calling the federal authorities. You committed cyber terrorism against this family and against Horizon Pharma. Turn the system on right now, or I swear I will have the police kick your door down and drag you out in handcuffs for data theft. You are going to rot in a federal prison cell." I read the aggressive words twice, letting the absolute magnitude of his delusion wash over me completely. He genuinely believed his empty, hollow threats still held power over me. He thought the mere word police would send me scrambling to comply with his demands. He was entirely blissfully oblivious to the reality that he was the one standing directly in the extremely bright spotlight of federal fraud. I set my coffee mug down on the desk. My hands were perfectly steady. My heart rate was slow, measured, and entirely controlled. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or intimidation reading his violent messages. I felt only the absolute, undeniable power of owning the complete truth. I placed my fingers over the digital keyboard on my phone screen. I did not write a lengthy emotional explanation. I did not defend my actions, explain my genius, or argue about the toxic family legacy. I simply delivered the cold, hard, inescapable facts of their impending destruction. I typed the response with methodical, ruthless precision. "Call them. I highly encourage it. Let us see exactly who the Federal Bureau of Investigation handcuffs for attempting to steal and sell $2 billion worth of intellectual property they never legally owned." I hit the send button. The message bubble turned a bright, solid blue, accompanied by the tiny notification that it had been delivered successfully. I locked the screen and tossed the phone casually onto the leather sofa. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors, watching the failed login attempts continue to cascade uselessly across the screen. Knowing that the golden child was currently staring at his phone, realizing he had just completely destroyed his own life. The aggressive, rhythmic pounding on my front door echoed through the quiet, controlled space of my apartment. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor or the quick tap of a delivery driver. It was the heavy, entitled strike of a man who believed every single door in the entire world should automatically open for him upon his arrival. I did not flinch. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. I simply shifted my gaze from my glowing monitors to the high-definition security camera feed displayed on my secondary screen. Richard stood in the hallway. My father looked entirely different from the impeccably groomed, arrogant chief executive who had ordered armed security to throw me out onto the street just 48 hours ago. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose around his neck. His face was flushed with a frantic, unhealthy shade of crimson. He was sweating profusely, shifting his substantial weight from side to side like a trapped animal rapidly running out of oxygen. He raised his clenched fist to strike the heavy wood of my door again. I walked to the entryway with measured, deliberate steps. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not greet him warmly. I did not step aside to welcome him into my private sanctuary. I stood squarely in the frame, projecting absolute immovable authority. Richard pushed his way inside anyway, using his sheer physical bulk to force past me into the living room. He stood in the center of my apartment, his eyes darting frantically across my multi-monitor setup, desperately searching for the magical keyboard that could instantly save his collapsing corporate empire. He took a deep, ragged breath, attempting to visibly gather his shattered composure and channel the commanding, invincible patriarch he had successfully played for over 30 years. "Let us end this childish tantrum right now, Gemma," Richard ordered. His voice was loud, attempting to fill the room, but it lacked its usual terrifying dominant resonance. The underlying tremor of absolute panic ruined his performance completely. "You have made your point loud and clear. You proved you are exceptionally clever. Now, it is time to act like an adult, put your petty grievances aside, and protect the family business." He reached inside his wrinkled suit jacket. His hand was trembling so violently that he struggled to retrieve his leather-bound checkbook from his breast pocket. He pulled out a pre-written check and slammed it down onto my kitchen island with a loud, aggressive smack. I looked down at the crisp piece of paper. The handwriting was jagged and rushed, a clear indication of his failing motor skills. The amount was written in bold, desperate strokes: $1 million. "There it is," Richard declared, puffing out his chest, attempting to project an aura of extreme benevolent generosity. $1 million, Gemma. Tax-free cash deposited directly into your account today. That is more money than you could have ever hoped to make working in that basement laboratory. All you have to do is sit down at that computer terminal, restore the commercial license to Horizon Pharma, and sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. We will even let you retain your prestigious title as lead researcher. You take the money, you fix the glitch you created, and we go back to being a happy, functional family." I stared at the piece of paper, then slowly raised my eyes to meet his. The sheer blinding audacity of his offer was almost comical. I did not blink. I did not express a single ounce of gratitude for his pathetic bribe. "You sold my intellectual property for $2 billion, I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy calm that filled the entire room. "You attempted to steal my entire life work to buy a luxury yacht for your useless son. And now, when the federal authorities are breathing directly down your neck, you think you can purchase my permanent submission with exactly 0.05% of the total acquisition value. You are not just a brazen thief, Richard. You are a profoundly terrible negotiator." The color completely drained from his face. The commanding patriarch vanished instantly, leaving behind a terrified, desperate old man facing the absolute destruction of his legacy. He took a stumbling step forward, abandoning his aggressive posture entirely. He raised his shaking hands in a placating, pathetic gesture of surrender. "Gemma, please," he begged, his voice cracking miserably. "Donovan gave us a strict ultimatum. He is going to lock me and your mother in a federal penitentiary by tomorrow morning. He is suing our holding company for $500 million in punitive damages. The bank is already preparing the paperwork to seize the estate. We are going to lose absolutely everything we have ever built. You are my daughter. You are my flesh and blood. You cannot do this to your own parents. You cannot destroy your own family over a business dispute." I crossed my arms over my chest, analyzing his sudden dramatic shift from dictatorial boss to weeping victim. "You destroyed this family the minute you decided my intelligence was merely a disposable tool to fund Brent's luxurious lifestyle," I replied effortlessly. "You stood in that glass boardroom and watched my mother call me delusional. You ordered armed guards to drag me out like a common criminal. You used your executive power to freeze my bank accounts so I would starve and come crawling back to you on my knees, begging for mercy. You did not care about flesh and blood yesterday morning. You only care about flesh and blood right now because I am the one holding the knife firmly to your throat." "Please," Richard sobbed, actual tears spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his flushed, aging cheeks. He fell heavily to his knees, his expensive slacks hitting the hardwood floor. "I will give you $5 million. I will give you $10 million. Just give me the access code. I am begging you on my hands and knees, Gemma. Please save me." I stepped forward and picked up the $1 million check from the marble counter. I held it gently between my fingers, letting the heavy silence stretch out, forcing him to stew in his own pathetic misery. For 33 years I lived in the dark, so your golden child could stand in the sun, I said quietly. You told me my science was entirely worthless unless it had a male face to sell it to the board. You told me my sole purpose in life was to quietly support the family legacy from the shadows. You demanded my respect, my absolute obedience, and my permanent silence. But you forgot one crucial detail about raising a brilliant silent daughter in a basement. Richard stared up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with desperate animalistic terror. I learned exactly how to build the foundational architecture of your entire world. I continued, my gaze piercing straight through his hollow, selfish soul. And I learned exactly how to successfully demolish it with a single keystroke. I gripped the edges of the check. With a slow, deliberate motion, I tore the thick paper directly down the middle. The ripping sound was exceptionally loud in the quiet apartment. I stacked the two halves together and tore them again. I let the shredded pieces flutter from my fingers, watching them fall like snow onto the kitchen floor, right next to his trembling hands. Your money holds absolutely zero value in my apartment, I stated coldly. Your parental authority is completely void. You are currently kneeling in the presence of the chief executive officer of Nemesis Tech, and I do not negotiate with corporate fraudsters under any circumstances. Richard let out a strangled, agonizing gasp, burying his face in his hands. Get out of my home, I ordered, pointing directly toward the hallway door. And you might want to call your elite defense attorneys immediately. Donovan is not known for his patience, and your 48-hour window is rapidly closing. The shredded pieces of my father's $1 million check were still resting on the kitchen floor when the security intercom buzzed for the second time that afternoon. I glanced at the surveillance feed displayed on my far left monitor. The man standing in the lobby was not a federal agent or a corporate lawyer. It was Lance. He looked absolutely wretched. His normally immaculate posture had completely collapsed. The crisp, arrogant aura he carried just 48 hours ago, when he dragged his leather suitcase out of my apartment, was entirely gone. He was holding a massive, obnoxious bouquet of red roses, gripping the plastic wrapping so tightly his knuckles were white. The sheer predictability of his behavior was almost insulting to my intelligence. I buzzed him up, curious to see exactly how a ruthless portfolio manager attempts to negotiate a completely bankrupt position. I unlocked the door and stepped back, crossing my arms over my chest. Lance practically stumbled into the entryway. His designer suit was rumpled, and he had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. The financial district gossip mill operates at lightning speed. By now, every single investment firm in San Francisco knew that the Horizon Pharma acquisition was a fraudulent catastrophe. Lance knew that Brent, the man who had just promised him a seven-figure chief financial officer position, was currently staring down the barrel of federal prison. Gemma, Lance gasped, his voice cracking with a desperate manufactured emotion. He shoved the bouquet of roses toward me like a physical shield. I am so incredibly sorry. I was an absolute fool. I did not take the flowers. I let them hover in the empty space between us until his arms started to tremble and he awkwardly lowered them to his side. Please, Gemma, you have to listen to me, Lance begged, stepping closer. The panic radiating from him was palpable. I did not know the truth. Brent completely manipulated me. He called me into his office and showed me fabricated financial projections. He told me you were having a severe psychological breakdown and that the company needed me to step in to protect the assets. He threatened to have me blacklisted from the entire financial sector if I did not play along with his transition plan. He forced me to leave you. I analyzed his facial micro-expressions, the slight twitch of his left eye, the rapid, shallow breathing. He was terrified, but he was still actively lying. He was a creature driven entirely by greed, and he was currently trying to pivot his loyalty back to the primary capital holder, me. I knew about Nemesis Tech. Lance continued his lies, becoming increasingly desperate and erratic. I knew you were the true genius behind the algorithm. I was just trying to infiltrate their inner circle so I could gather evidence for you. We are a team, Gemma. We have always been a team. Now that you have full control of the $2 billion asset, we can build our own empire. I can manage the wealth. I know the exact investment vehicles to maximize your returns. We can dominate this city together." To my absolute disgust, Lance suddenly dropped to his knees right there on the hardwood floor. He clasped his hands together in a theatrical display of remorse, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. The man who had mocked my cheap clothes, the man who had called me a financial liability, was now literally groveling at my feet. "I am begging you, Gemma," he cried, forcing a single tear to fall down his cheek. "Take me back. I love you. I have always loved you. I was just confused and manipulated by your toxic family." I maintained complete, unbroken silence. I did not yell. I did not list his betrayals. Explaining my feelings to a parasite is a massive waste of cognitive energy. Instead, I turned away from his pathetic display and walked calmly over to my desk. I picked up a thick, heavy manila envelope that my legal team had couriered to me earlier that morning. I walked back to where Lance was kneeling and dropped the envelope directly onto the floor in front of his knees. The heavy paper slapped against the wood. Lance looked down at the envelope, his fake tears instantly stopping. He hesitated, his survival instincts finally kicking in, sensing a trap. He slowly reached out with trembling fingers, opened the metal clasp, and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. His eyes scanned the first page. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He flipped frantically to the second page, then the third, his breathing becoming sharp and ragged. "What is this?" He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. I looked down at him with absolute, freezing detachment. "That is a formal demand for immediate payment in full," I stated clearly. "You see, Lance, when Brent promised you that brand new Porsche as a signing bonus, he needed a clean credit profile to secure the initial vehicle release from the dealership. His own credit is completely destroyed by outstanding corporate debts. Since I flagged my stolen corporate card and halted the down payment transaction, the dealership financing department immediately defaulted to the primary guarantor on the vehicle lease agreement." Lance stared at the paperwork in sheer, unadulterated horror. His name was printed in bold black ink across the top of the debt collection notice. "You eagerly signed the guarantor paperwork because you thought you were stepping into a seven-figure executive role." I continued driving the final nail into his financial coffin. "The dealership is now holding you personally liable for the entire purchase price of a heavily customized luxury sports car that you do not even possess. You currently owe them $185,000 payable immediately to avoid severe legal action and a total destruction of your personal credit score. But I do not have that kind of liquid capital." Lance panicked, dropping the papers onto the floor. "I cannot pay this. If I get a massive default on my record, I will lose my portfolio manager license. I will be completely ruined. I will never work in finance again." I stepped over the scattered documents, moving closer to the front door. I placed my hand on the brass handle and pulled it wide open. The cool hallway air rushed into the apartment. "I highly suggest you start liquidating your designer suits," I said, my voice devoid of any human sympathy. "And you should probably call your new best friend Brent to see if he can spot you alone. Though I hear he is currently facing his own significant cash flow problems." Lance scrambled to his feet. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and sudden blinding realization that he had just played the worst hand of his entire professional career. He opened his mouth to beg again, to plead for mercy, but the absolute 0-degree temperature in my eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. He knew there was no negotiation. The market had spoken, and his stock had crashed to zero. He grabbed his pathetic bouquet of roses from the console table and stumbled out into the hallway. His shoulders slumped in total devastating defeat. I slammed the heavy door shut, locking the deadbolt with a satisfying metallic click. The apartment was finally purged of his toxic presence. But the war was not entirely over. My monitors suddenly flared with a new aggressive red warning light. Brent was out of legal options, and he was now resorting to something far more dangerous. The secondary monitor on my far right illuminated with a harsh, pulsing crimson glare. It was a highly specific threat detection protocol I had written months ago. The system was designed to silently flag unauthorized forceful penetration attempts directed at the encrypted local network of Nemesis Tech. I walked away from the locked front door and settled back into my ergonomic leather chair. My fingers rested lightly on the mechanical keyboard. I did not feel panic. I felt an intense clinical fascination. Brent was completely out of time, completely out of money, and completely out of legal maneuvers. Donovan had trapped him in a corner with the threat of a massive federal lawsuit and imminent prison time. My brother had always been a creature of pure impulse. When his fragile ego was threatened, he invariably resorted to brute force. Since he could not physically intimidate me into handing over the artificial intelligence algorithm, he had opted for the most dangerous and illegal route available in Silicon Valley: corporate espionage. I pulled up the primary security dashboard. The incoming traffic was heavy, coordinated, and incredibly aggressive. This was not a standard automated phishing script. This was a highly targeted, multi-layered cyber attack. Brent possessed the technical aptitude of a rock. He could barely format a basic spreadsheet without asking an intern for assistance. He had absolutely zero capacity to execute a network breach of this magnitude. That meant he had hired outside help. He must have tapped into the darkest corners of the digital black market, promising exorbitant, non-existent future payouts to mercenary hackers. He was desperately trying to steal the foundational source code directly from my personal servers to save his own skin. It was a massive federal crime carrying a mandatory minimum sentence that would effectively end his life in civilized society. I watched the graphical representation of the attack unfold across my screens. The mercenaries were currently bombarding my external firewall with a massive distributed denial of service attack, attempting to blind my defensive protocols while simultaneously probing for vulnerabilities in the routing architecture. It was a sophisticated strategy, but it was entirely useless against a system I had built from the ground up to withstand corporate warfare. My security infrastructure easily absorbed the shockwave. The encryption keys shifted randomly every 4 seconds, rendering their forced entry tools completely obsolete. I could have simply severed the external connection and permanently locked them out with a single keystroke. I could have watched them waste hours banging their heads against a digital brick wall until their contract expired. But blocking them would not solve my ultimate problem. If I simply repelled the attack, Brent would just keep trying. He would hire different hackers. He would find more desperate criminals. He would remain a constant, unpredictable threat lingering on the periphery of my newly established empire. I needed to neutralize him completely. I needed to give him exactly what he wanted, but in a way that would orchestrate his spectacular public destruction. I opened a secure, isolated sandbox environment within my internal network. It was a digital quarantine zone completely separated from the actual core algorithm that powered the genetic prediction software. Inside this secure vacuum, I began to rapidly construct a decoy. I created a sprawling directory of highly complex, incredibly dense code. To an outside observer, it looked exactly like the $2 billion artificial intelligence model. It had the correct file structures, the appropriate naming conventions, and the massive data weight required to convince a panicked executive that he had just struck pure gold. I labeled the primary executable file with the exact project designation Brent had used during his fraudulent investor presentations. But the file did not contain a single line of functional biological modeling. It contained something far more potent. I engineered a highly aggressive self-executing digital payload. Once the file was opened on a target machine, it would not run a genetic simulation. Instead, it would immediately hijack the host network. It would forcefully activate all connected audiovisual peripherals, lock the administrative controls, and initiate a massive, uncontainable data wipe of the host server. I embedded a specific high-definition video file into the very center of the payload, programming it to broadcast on a continuous loop the second the trap was sprung. I finished compiling the decoy package and placed it deliberately in a folder near the outer edge of my security perimeter. I named the folder Master Source Code Archive. It was the digital equivalent of leaving a solid gold bar sitting on a park bench. Then I executed the most dangerous maneuver of the entire evening. I intentionally introduced a microfracture into my own firewall. I created a tiny, barely perceptible vulnerability in the outer defense grid, leaving a direct, poorly shielded pathway straight to the decoy folder. I leaned back in my chair and watched the monitors. The mercenary hackers found the vulnerability almost instantly. The red warning lights flashed faster as their extraction protocols latched onto the opening. They flooded through the digital gap, completely bypassing the hardened sectors of my network and headed straight for the glowing bait. My system alerted me that a massive data transfer had been initiated. The progress bar moved rapidly across my central screen. The hackers were downloading the entire decoy directory. They were moving so fast, fueled by the promise of Brent's desperate payout, that they did not even bother to verify the structural integrity of the files they were stealing. They just grabbed the heavy data package and ran. I sat in the quiet glow of my command center, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The progress bar hit 100%. The external connection severed immediately, as the hackers retreated into the shadows, covering their tracks and securing their stolen prize. The red warning lights on my monitors slowly faded back to a calm, steady blue. The silence in the apartment was profound. The cyber attack was over. I knew exactly what was happening across the city. The mercenary hackers were currently transferring the massive file to Brent. My brother was likely sitting in his expensive car, sweating through his designer suit, holding his laptop with trembling hands. He would see the file name and believe he had just outsmarted me. He would believe he had just saved his mansion, his reputation, and his $2 billion deal with Horizon Pharma. He would feel a rush of arrogant, unearned victory. He had absolutely no idea that he had just downloaded a digital guillotine. He was holding a ticking time bomb, and he was planning to walk it directly into the most secure corporate boardroom in California. I smiled, a genuine cold expression of absolute certainty. The trap was perfectly set. The final execution simply required him to plug it in. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across my apartment floor as my secondary monitor suddenly flickered to life. The digital beacon I had carefully embedded inside the decoy payload had just successfully activated. Brent had actually done it. He had physically carried the infected flash drive directly into the primary executive boardroom of Horizon Pharma. Through the compromised audio and visual peripherals of the host machine, I now had a crystal-clear front row seat to his absolute destruction. I leaned forward in my ergonomic leather chair, interlacing my fingers and watching the live feed. The high-definition camera feed showed the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the boardroom. The space was an intimidating display of corporate power, featuring cold lighting, expensive artwork, and a massive mahogany table. Donovan stood at the head of the table, his face a hard mask of barely contained corporate fury. My father Richard sat rigidly to his left, violently wiping sweat from his forehead with a crumpled linen handkerchief. My mother Patricia was clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were completely white. They were staring directly at the heavy glass doors, waiting desperately for their golden child to deliver their salvation. The heavy doors swung open. Brent marched into the room with the ridiculous swagger of a conquering Roman emperor. He was wearing a brand new tailored charcoal suit that he likely bought on credit. He practically beamed with arrogant pride, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality of his situation. He held up a sleek silver universal serial bus drive between his thumb and index finger, waving it around the room like a championship trophy. "I told you there was absolutely nothing to worry about," Brent announced loudly. His confident voice echoed cleanly through my desktop speakers. "The situation is entirely resolved. The rogue employee has been dealt with permanently, and I have personally secured the master source code archive. You can relax now, Dad. I handled the crisis." Donovan did not look amused. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. He pointed a rigid, commanding finger at the main presentation console. "Plug it in right now, Brent. Dr. Caldwell will verify the structural integrity of the genetic algorithms immediately. If this is another one of your elaborate time-wasting delays, I am having federal marshals arrest you in this very lobby for criminal fraud." Brent scoffed, feigning absolute, untouchable confidence. He strutted over to the primary terminal, purposefully brushing past the chief technology officer. I will run the execution sequence myself, Donovan. I want you to see firsthand exactly why I am the vice president of this enterprise. I handle the high-pressure situations while the scientists hide in the background. I watched Brent insert the silver drive into the terminal port. A small notification popped up on his screen. He eagerly navigated to the folder labeled Master Source Code Archive. He paused for a fraction of a second, likely anticipating a massive round of applause, before he double-clicked the heavily encrypted executable file I had meticulously designed for him. "It is loading now," Brent declared with a massive, triumphant grin, turning to face his audience. "You are about to see the greatest biological predictive model on the planet." He was technically right. They were about to witness a spectacular execution, just not the one he promised. For a single agonizing second, the massive presentation screens across the boardroom went entirely pitch black. Richard let out a sharp gasp. Patricia gripped the edge of the polished table. Donovan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing into deadly, calculating slits. Then the screen snapped into brilliant 4,000-pixel resolution. It was not a sleek, intuitive genetic modeling interface. It was raw security camera footage. The video played in stark, undeniable, and brutal clarity. It showed the dimly lit underground parking garage of a seedy industrial complex on the edge of the city. The timestamp glowing brightly in the corner confirmed it was recorded at exactly 3:00 this morning. Brent was standing next to a sleek black luxury vehicle, nervously handing a thick, heavy leather briefcase full of banded $100 bills to a man wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt. The audio kicked in, perfectly amplified by the state-of-the-art surround sound system of the Horizon Pharma boardroom. "I do not care how many firewalls she has," Brent's voice boomed from the overhead speakers, echoing loudly enough to rattle the glass walls. "You hack into my sister's personal servers, and you rip that source code out tonight. I am paying you to completely destroy her network. Do not leave a single trace behind. I want her entire digital life ruined." The color vanished instantly from Brent's face. He spun around, staring at the massive screens in sheer, unadulterated terror. He lunged toward the keyboard, frantically slamming his fingers against the keys, desperately trying to close the video player or shut down the machine. It was completely useless. I had firmly locked him out of all administrative controls. He was a prisoner to his own cinematic debut. "What the hell is this?" Richard screamed, jumping out of his chair so fast it tipped over backwards. He pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "Brent, what did you do? You hired criminal hackers?" Before Brent could stammer out a pathetic, cowardly excuse, a secondary terminal window violently popped open right next to the playing video. It was a stark black box filled with rapidly scrolling lines of aggressive bright red code. Dr. Caldwell shoved Brent forcefully out of the way and stared at the console, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale. "It is a highly aggressive computer worm," Caldwell shouted, his voice cracking with absolute professional panic. "But it is not attacking the Horizon network. It is using our bandwidth to tunnel directly backward through the active connection." Tunneling backward to where Donovan demanded his voice, a low, terrifying growl that demanded immediate answers. Caldwell typed furiously, attempting to analyze the digital trajectory. "It is targeting the central database of their family business. It is completely bypassing all their external security protocols because Brent gave it direct authenticated access." I sat in my apartment watching the final phase of my masterstroke execute flawlessly. The payload was not designed to harm innocent bystanders at Horizon Pharma. It was designed for extreme surgical precision. It was seeking out the vulnerable servers that held the entire history of my family empire. Sir Caldwell yelled, stepping away from the infected machine as if it were a highly volatile physical bomb. "The malware is systematically executing a total unrecoverable data wipe. It is currently erasing their active client records, their accounting ledgers, their payroll systems, and decades of their proprietary corporate communications. It is burning their entire corporate infrastructure to the ground. There is absolutely nothing I can do to stop it." Patricia let out a piercing, agonizing shriek, collapsing back into her leather chair as the realization hit her. Richard clutched his chest, struggling to breathe as he watched his entire life work vanish into digital ash line by line on the massive screen. Brent just stood there entirely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in silent, catastrophic horror. He had not just brought a stolen car to a police station. He had actively driven a rigged explosive device directly into the heart of his own fortress, and he had handed the detonator straight to his victims. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid settle pleasantly in my chest. The golden child had finally received exactly what he paid for. The massive high-definition screens inside the Horizon Pharma boardroom abruptly cut to black. The catastrophic digital wipe of my family corporate servers was completely finished. The only sound left in the cavernous executive suite was the ragged, panicked hyperventilation coming from my brother. Brent was gripping the edge of the polished mahogany table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. His expensive charcoal suit was completely soaked in a cold, terrified sweat. Donovan did not yell this time. He did not throw another glass pitcher. The chief executive officer of Horizon Pharma simply raised his right hand and signaled to the heavily armed private security personnel stationed outside the glass walls. Two massive guards stepped directly inside the room, taking position firmly in front of the exit. The heavy wooden doors secured with a definitive metallic click. The boardroom was officially under absolute lockdown. No one was leaving. Richard collapsed heavily into his leather executive chair. His breathing was dangerously shallow. The arrogant patriarch, who had ruthlessly ordered my termination just days ago, was entirely gone. He was currently staring at his trembling hands, fully comprehending that his entire manufacturing empire, his offshore accounts, his client databases, and his retirement funds had just been incinerated into digital dust. He had nothing left. He was a completely broke, highly exposed corporate fraudster sitting in the epicenter of a $2 billion crime scene. Patricia sat frozen beside him. The emerald designer gown she wore suddenly looked entirely ridiculous, like a cheap costume on a tragic, aging actress. She desperately clutched her diamond necklace, her eyes darting around the room looking for anyone to manipulate. But there was no sympathetic audience left to deceive. "You are all going to federal prison," Donovan stated. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that carried the full lethal weight of a corporate titan who had just been deeply insulted. "I am not just going to sue your holding company into permanent bankruptcy. I am going to make absolute certain that the Department of Justice prosecutes each of you to the fullest extent of the law. You brought criminal hackers into my headquarters. You attempted to sell me a hollow shell. You will spend the rest of your miserable lives in a concrete cell. Please!" Richard choked out, his voice cracking pitifully. "Donovan, listen to me. We can fix this. I will sign over the deed to my estate. I will liquidate every single personal asset I own to compensate you for the inconvenience. We were just as surprised by that malicious software as you were. My daughter orchestrated this entire sabotage to destroy us. She is a deeply disturbed, vindictive individual." Donovan looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You truly believe I care about your pathetic suburban real estate?" he sneered coldly. "You just wiped your own servers, Richard. Your company is mathematically worthless. You have absolutely zero collateral to offer me." Before Richard could stammer out another pathetic, crawling plea for mercy, the electronic lock on the boardroom doors glowed green. The two massive security guards immediately stepped aside, their posture shifting from aggressive containment to respectful attention. The heavy mahogany doors swung open wide. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the center of the executive boardroom. I was not carrying a cardboard box filled with cheap desk supplies. I was not wearing the casual, practical clothes of a basement programmer. I was wearing a meticulously tailored midnight blue designer power suit that projected absolute, undeniable authority. The sharp click of my stiletto heels against the hardwood floor cut through the suffocating tension of the room like a perfectly timed metronome. Sylvia walked smoothly one step behind my right shoulder. My intellectual property attorney looked like an apex predator hunting in her natural habitat. She carried a sleek black leather briefcase containing the absolute destruction of the people sitting at the table. The collective reaction from my family was deeply, profoundly satisfying. Brent physically recoiled, shrinking back into his leather chair as if he were trying to merge with the upholstery. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally recognizing the monstrous consequence of his own aggressive stupidity. Patricia let out a sharp, genuine gasp, pressing her hand firmly over her mouth to stifle a cry. All the color drained completely from Richard's face. He stared at me as if he were looking at a resurrected ghost, coming to drag him straight down into the underworld. Donovan turned away from my shattered family and focused his intense, calculating gaze entirely on me. His defensive posture relaxed slightly. He was a seasoned businessman, and he instantly recognized the dramatic shift in the power dynamic. The actual owner of the $2 billion asset had finally arrived to the negotiating table. "Good morning, Donovan," I said, my voice ringing with cool, perfectly measured confidence. "I apologize for the slight delay in my arrival. I had to ensure my local security protocols were properly executing before leaving my apartment. I trust my brother provided an adequate demonstration of my defensive architecture." Donovan let out a sharp, humorless bark of a laugh. "Your brother just detonated his own corporate infrastructure on my presentation screens. It was incredibly educational." I walked past my trembling parents without giving them a single glance. I moved directly to the opposite end of the massive mahogany table, claiming the seat of supreme authority directly across from Donovan. I unbuttoned my suit jacket and sat down smoothly. Sylvia took the seat to my right, placing her leather briefcase onto the polished table with a heavy, authoritative thud. "You cannot be here!" Patricia hissed, her voice trembling, with a mixture of sheer panic and lingering, desperate entitlement. "You have absolutely no security clearance. Donovan, have her arrested immediately. She is the one who hacked your systems." Sylvia did not even look at my mother. She simply popped the metal latches on her briefcase. "I highly suggest you remain completely silent, Patricia," Sylvia advised coldly. "You are currently an uninvited guest, sitting at a table where billionaires conduct actual business." I folded my hands together and rested them on the table, looking directly into Donovan's eyes. "I am fully aware of the fraudulent contract Richard and Brent attempted to execute yesterday," I stated clearly. "They sold you a revocable commercial license that was officially terminated the exact second they ordered security to remove me from their premises. They own nothing, they control nothing. They are currently facing catastrophic federal charges for corporate espionage and massive financial fraud." Donovan nodded slowly, leaning forward in his chair. "And where does that leave us, Gemma? Because I am currently holding a massive pile of useless legal documents and a very strong desire to ruin someone permanently." I smiled, a sharp, calculating expression that sealed their ultimate fate. "It leaves us with an incredibly lucrative opportunity, Donovan. My family brought you a stolen, empty vehicle. I brought you the actual registered title to the engine. We are going to erase them from the equation entirely, and we are going to conduct a real transaction." Donovan steepled his fingers, leaning back in his heavy leather executive chair. He looked directly at Richard, a cold, calculating predator observing a cornered, severely injured animal. The silence stretched across the massive boardroom, heavy and suffocating, before the chief executive officer of Horizon Pharma finally spoke. His voice did not echo, but it carried a terrifying weight that seemed to instantly suck the remaining oxygen out of the entire room. Richard Donovan began, his tone entirely devoid of the polite, professional courtesy he had displayed during the acquisition signing yesterday. "You came into my headquarters and presented yourself as a visionary corporate leader. You sat in my chair, drank my coffee, and smiled confidently, while handing my team a digitally engineered time bomb. You assured my board of directors that your company owned the exclusive, undisputed rights to a biological algorithm that you knew perfectly well belonged to someone else. You attempted to sell me a stolen ghost." The lead counsel of Horizon Pharma stepped forward at Donovan's silent, commanding gesture. He carried a thick, heavy stack of documents, the original acquisition agreement signed just 24 hours prior. With a sharp, deliberate motion, the lawyer dropped the heavy stack directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The loud, violent smack made Brent physically jump in his seat, a pathetic whimper escaping his throat. Donovan pointed a rigid finger at the stack of paper. "That agreement is completely null and void. The $2 billion acquisition of your manufacturing and development firm is officially and permanently cancelled. We are halting all scheduled financial transfers immediately. Not a single cent will ever reach your offshore holding accounts. Your company is mathematically dead. Your legacy is entirely erased. You are walking out of this building with absolutely nothing. Patricia gasped loudly, her hands gripping the edge of the table so fiercely, her manicured nails looked ready to snap under the pressure. Donovan, please, you cannot do this, she begged, her voice shrill and desperate. We have already signed the transition paperwork. We made massive public announcements. The financial markets are already reacting to the merger. We can restructure the deal right now. We can give you a massive discount on the acquisition price. Do not let Gemma ruin this incredible opportunity for all of us. Donovan ignored her desperate, pathetic pleading entirely. He kept his dark eyes locked firmly on Richard. Canceling the acquisition is simply the first step of my response today, Richard. You committed a massive, highly coordinated fraud against a publicly traded pharmaceutical corporation. You hired criminal mercenaries to infiltrate a secure network, which subsequently infected my presentation hardware and completely destroyed your own internal database. You aggressively endangered my enterprise, my shareholders, and my professional reputation. Donovan leaned forward, planting his large hands flat on the table, projecting absolute dominance over the shattered family. Therefore, Horizon Pharma is officially filing a massive civil lawsuit against you, Patricia and Brent personally. We are suing you for $500 million in punitive damages, breach of contract, and intentional malicious misrepresentation. We will freeze every single personal asset you currently possess before the market closes today. Patricia let out a piercing, agonizing scream. It was not a calculated, manipulative cry designed to garner sympathy like the ones she used at her social galas. It was the raw, primal shriek of a woman watching her entire affluent reality disintegrate into ash. She stood up violently, her chair scraping loudly and aggressively against the hardwood floor. You cannot sue us for $500 million, she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Donovan, and then turning her wrath entirely toward me. This is all her fault. She set us up. She manipulated the digital system to make us look guilty. Arrest her right now. Sylvia, my attorney, spoke up calmly, her voice cutting through Patricia's hysterical noise like a razor blade through silk. I highly advise you to sit down and remain completely silent, Patricia. Anything you say in this room is currently being documented by the Horizon Pharma legal team. You are actively confessing to your direct involvement in a criminal conspiracy. Patricia ignored the sharp legal warning, her perfectly constructed socialite facade shattering completely. She lunged toward my side of the massive table, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. You ungrateful, malicious wretch, she screamed at me, her voice breaking into a hoarse, ugly sob. We gave you everything. We gave you a job when no one else would hire your strange personality. We put a roof over your head. You are destroying your own family out of pure, bitter jealousy. You are ruining our entire lives. I sat perfectly still, completely unfazed by her aggressive, desperate outburst. I did not blink. I simply watched her unravel from a place of absolute, untouchable power. You ruined your own lives the exact moment you decided my intellect was a disposable commodity you could steal and sell without my permission, I stated coldly, my voice steady and completely devoid of any daughterly affection. While Patricia continued her loud, erratic meltdown, my eyes shifted down the table to my father. Richard had not moved an inch. He had not defended his screaming wife or attempted to negotiate further with the furious chief executive officer. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was completely paralyzed. The terrifying words $500 million echoed endlessly in his mind, rapidly breaking down the last remaining structural walls of his psychological endurance. He knew his company was already destroyed by Brent's aggressive malware. He knew his reputation in Silicon Valley was permanently annihilated. And now he realized that every single personal asset he owned, the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in Atherton, the offshore investment portfolios, the luxury vehicles, and the exclusive country club memberships, would be aggressively seized by Donovan's legal team. He was not just returning to zero. He was descending rapidly into a bottomless, suffocating pit of inescapable corporate debt. Suddenly, Richard's face lost all its remaining color, turning a horrifying ashen gray. A thick sheen of cold, clammy sweat coated his forehead and neck. He let out a sharp, choked gasp, his right hand flying up to desperately clutch the center of his chest. His thick fingers dug deeply into the expensive fabric of his tailored suit, right over his failing heart. Dad, Brent yelled, his voice cracking with absolute paralyzing terror as he finally snapped out of his own cowardly stupor. Richard tried to draw a breath, but his lungs refused to expand. His eyes widened in sheer physical agony. The crushing, undeniable weight of his monumental failure, combined with the absolute terror of the impending federal charges and financial ruin, had triggered a catastrophic physical response. He let out a low, agonizing groan. His legs gave out completely beneath the heavy wooden table. He collapsed heavily backward, his large frame sinking deeply into the leather executive chair. His head rolled limply to the side, his breathing becoming a rapid series of ragged, terrifying wheezes. Patricia stopped her hysterical screaming instantly. She turned and saw her husband slouched in the chair, violently clutching his chest and gasping for air. A new, entirely different kind of panic seized her completely. She rushed to his side, her trembling hands hovering uselessly over his pale, sweating face. "Richard!" She cried out, her voice high and frantically terrified. "Richard, look at me. Breathe. Somebody call an ambulance right now. He is having a massive heart attack." The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom remained securely locked. The massive security guards did not flinch or move to assist the collapsing patriarch. They looked directly at Donovan, awaiting their strict, unyielding orders. Donovan watched the pathetic, crumbling display of the man who had tried to swindle him out of billions. He reached slowly into his tailored pocket, pulled out his smartphone, and calmly dialed emergency medical services. "Send a medical unit to the executive boardroom at Horizon Pharma." Donovan instructed the dispatcher, his voice completely devoid of any human sympathy or warmth. "We have a man experiencing a severe cardiac event. Tell them to hurry. He has a very important appointment with federal criminal investigators later this afternoon, and I need him breathing to face his prison sentencing." Donovan ended the call and placed the phone face down onto the polished table. He looked at Brent, who was standing completely frozen next to his collapsing father, sobbing openly and uncontrollably like a terrified, helpless child. "Your toxic family legacy is officially over," Donovan pronounced, delivering the final crushing blow to the fraudulent golden child. "You have absolutely nothing left in this world." I remained seated perfectly upright at the opposite end of the massive table, watching the chaotic, life-threatening medical emergency unfold before my very eyes. I felt no urge whatsoever to rush to my father's side. I felt no lingering biological affection compelling me to comfort my hysterical, screaming mother. The familial bond had been permanently surgically severed the moment they ordered armed security to throw me out of my own laboratory. I simply sat beside my attorney, perfectly composed, watching the cruel architects of my lifelong misery face the absolute devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. Donovan stood up with a slow, terrifying grace that commanded the entire room to fall into a state of absolute submission. He did not look back at the gasping, ashen man slumping in the leather executive chair. He did not offer so much as a glance to the woman wailing on the expensive hardwood floor, clutching at his tailored trousers like a common beggar. To Donovan, my parents were no longer formidable business entities or even human beings worthy of his attention. They were simply failed variables, broken components that had been successfully purged from a high-stakes equation. He stepped over my mother's trembling arm with a clinical indifference that was more chilling than any shout. The electronic locks on the boardroom doors hissed open, and a team of paramedics rushed inside with a gurney, their footsteps sounding like a frantic drumbeat against the silence. They swarmed around Richard, attaching monitors and barking medical shorthand, but Donovan merely gestured for them to work quickly and quietly. He moved with a predatory elegance around the long mahogany table, his focus shifting entirely toward me. Patricia was forced to stand as the medical team began to wheel my father toward the exit. She looked at me, her eyes bloodshot and filled with a desperate, animalistic hatred. She opened her mouth to scream one final insult to call me a traitor or a monster, but the words died in her throat as she saw Donovan's expression. He looked at her with a disgust so profound it seemed to physically push her out of the room. "Go with your husband," Patricia Donovan said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "You are no longer permitted on this floor. You are no longer permitted in this industry. My security will ensure you reach the hospital, but after that do not ever attempt to contact Horizon Pharma or its affiliates again. You are done." The doors closed behind the gurney and my mother, leaving only the wreckage of my brother in the room. Brent was still standing by the window, his charcoal suit soaked in sweat, staring at the empty space where his father had just collapsed. He looked like a child who had just realized the monster under the bed was real, and it was currently wearing a midnight blue power suit. Donovan stopped exactly 3 feet away from me. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The suffocating weight of the previous hour evaporated, replaced by a sharp electric sense of professional possibility. Donovan extended his hand across the table, his gaze locking onto mine with a level of respect he had never once shown my father or brother. "Gemma," he began, his voice now carrying a rich, resonant warmth, "I have spent 20 years in this industry looking for true innovation. I have sat through thousands of pitches from men who promised me the moon and delivered only dust. I knew the moment I saw your genetic predictive models that I was looking at something that would redefine the next century of medicine. My only mistake was believing for a single second that those two frauds were the ones who built it." I took a deep breath, smoothing the lapel of my power suit, and stood up to meet him. I took his hand, and his grip was firm, dry, and certain. It was the handshake of an equal, a silent acknowledgement between two titans. Sylvia stood up beside me, opening her sleek black briefcase and sliding a thick stack of finalized legal documents toward the center of the table. Brent took a staggering step forward, his eyes wide and bloodshot as he looked at the paperwork. "What are you doing?" Brent choked out, his voice cracking with a pathetic, high-pitched desperation. "That is our company. You cannot just negotiate with her. We have a signed contract, Donovan. You owe us $2 billion. Donovan did not even turn his head to look at the sobbing shell of my brother. "I have already declared your contract null and void due to catastrophic fraud and material misrepresentation," Donovan stated with a freezing, absolute finality. "You sold me a product you did not own. You committed federal crimes to secure a payout. You have zero standing in this room. If you speak one more word, my guards will physically remove you and hand you directly to the federal marshals waiting in the lobby." Brent collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his shaking hands, a low, broken whimper escaping his lips. He was finally understanding the magnitude of his failure. He was witnessing the birth of my empire from the ashes of his own. Donovan turned back to me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. He picked up a heavy fountain pen and looked at the board members who were still sitting in shocked silence around the room. "Gentlemen," Donovan announced, his voice projecting with an authority that echoed off the glass walls. "Today, Horizon Pharma is correcting a monumental oversight. We are not interested in acquiring a hollow shell company run by incompetent grifters. We are interested in the technology that will change the world and the brilliant architect who owns it. Therefore, I am officially announcing that Horizon Pharma has finalized a commercial merger agreement with Nemesis Tech. We are acquiring the entire intellectual property portfolio, including the master source code for the genetic predictive algorithm and all subsidiary assets." He paused, looking directly at the cowering figure of my brother, before delivering the final crushing blow. "The total acquisition price for Nemesis Tech is $2.5 billion. Brent let out a strangled, agonizing gasp that sounded like he was being physically choked. $2.5 billion, he whispered, his head snapping up to look at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. "That is $500 million more than you offered us." "Exactly," Donovan replied, his smile sharp and victorious. "Because Gemma knows the true value of her intellect, and she knows how to protect it. She is a visionary, Brent. You are just a parasite who forgot that you need a host to survive." Donovan leaned over the table and scrawled his signature on the first page of the Nemesis Tech merger. I took the pen from his hand and added my own signature with a steady, practiced flourish. The deal was done. In a matter of minutes, the power dynamic of my entire life had been permanently and legally inverted. The daughter they had hidden in a basement, the sister they had mocked as an unstable failure, was now the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar tech entity. I was no longer Gemma, the data entry clerk. I was Gemma, the Titan. I looked at Brent one last time. He was staring at the signed documents, his mouth hanging open, in a state of catastrophic shock. He realized that while they were being sued for $500 million and facing federal prison, I was walking out of this building with a fortune that dwarfed anything our family had ever dreamed of possessing. They had tried to steal my future for pennies, and in doing so, they had handed me the entire world on a silver platter. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the servers I now owned. I picked up my leather briefcase, adjusted my jacket, and looked at Donovan. "Let us get to work," I said. I did not look back as I walked out of the room, leaving the golden child to rot in the silence of his own making. Just as I secured the signed merger agreement into the sleek leather briefcase, the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung open with an authoritative, violent force. The private security guards immediately stepped aside, making a wide path for 5 individuals wearing sharp, dark, tactical windbreakers. The bold, bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across their backs instantly drained the remaining oxygen from the room. The lead agent, a tall, imposing woman with a severely sharp jawline and a gaze made of absolute steel, walked directly toward the center of the shattered corporate battlefield. She did not ask for permission to enter the private premises. She operated with the undeniable crushing authority of the federal government. My brother, still paralyzed in his leather chair, slowly turned his head. The final lingering shreds of his arrogant ego completely evaporated, replaced instantly by the raw, primal terror of a trapped criminal. The lead agent stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him. She reached into her dark jacket and pulled out a folded federal warrant. "Brent," she announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls with lethal surgical precision. "You are under arrest for severe corporate espionage, intentional deployment of malicious commercial software, and massive federal wire fraud." Brent practically fell out of his expensive executive chair, scrambling backward until his spine hit the reinforced glass partition. He raised his shaking hands, frantically pointing a trembling, sweaty finger directly at me. "No, you have the wrong person!" he shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that stripped him of any remaining dignity. "She is the one who set this up. She manipulated the external servers. I am just a sales executive. I do not know anything about computer coding or advanced malware. I was just trying to save our family company." The federal agent did not even blink at his desperate, cowardly deflection. "We possess highly secured 4,000-pixel video evidence of you conducting a direct cash transaction with known black market cybercriminals," the agent stated coldly. "We also hold the precise digital footprint of your personal authorization credentials, actively deploying a highly destructive payload onto a commercial pharmaceutical network. Turn around and place your hands firmly behind your back." Brent began to hyperventilate, sobbing openly and uncontrollably as 2 heavily armed agents moved in on him. They grabbed his arms with practiced, unyielding force, twisting them sharply behind his back. The crisp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists was the most beautiful, satisfying symphony I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was the undeniable sound of absolute, inescapable justice. The golden child, the arrogant man who had mocked my cheap clothes and aggressively stolen my life work, was being physically dragged out of the corporate headquarters in front of the entire executive board. He wept like an absolute coward, begging for a father who was no longer there to bail him out of his own catastrophic consequences. The federal agent loudly recited his Miranda rights as they shoved him through the heavy wooden doors, his expensive Italian suit wrinkling horribly under the forceful grip of the law. The swift, crushing hand of federal justice did not stop at the boardroom doors. While Brent was being forcefully shoved into the back of a black government vehicle in the corporate plaza, a secondary unit of federal investigators had already intercepted the ambulance carrying my father. Richard had barely survived his panic-induced cardiac event, but his awakening at the hospital was far from a peaceful recovery. He opened his heavy eyes in a sterile, brightly lit hospital room, only to find two federal agents standing strict guard at his door. They formally served him with a massive $500 million civil lawsuit from Horizon Pharma, running concurrently with a heavy federal indictment for deep conspiracy to commit corporate fraud. The untouchable, ruthless patriarch was officially a heavily guarded prisoner. He was tethered to a beeping heart monitor, facing a maximum security prison sentence that would undoubtedly outlast his remaining years on Earth. He stared at the stark ceiling, fully realizing that his boundless greed had successfully engineered his own permanent destruction. Patricia, who had been weeping hysterically in the hospital waiting room, received a devastating, fatal phone call of her own. It was not from a sympathetic friend or a high society ally offering a shoulder to cry on. It was the primary lending officer from their elite, highly exclusive wealth management bank. Because Donovan had aggressively and successfully frozen all their corporate and personal assets, they had instantly defaulted on their massive, highly leveraged lines of credit. The bank was aggressively executing an emergency foreclosure on the sprawling multi-million-dollar Atherton estate. The lending officer strictly forbade Patricia from returning to the property. The luxury vehicles, the designer gowns, the imported custom furniture, and the priceless artwork were currently being seized by federal marshals to cover the monumental financial damages they had caused. She had absolutely nowhere to go. Her elite social circle completely abandoned her the exact second the breaking news of the corporate espionage hit the local financial networks. She was a destitute, disgraced outcast, standing in a public hospital lobby with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dead smartphone battery. I walked confidently out of the Horizon Pharma headquarters alongside Sylvia. The crisp, cool San Francisco air filled my lungs, tasting incredibly pure and completely untainted by their toxic presence. I stood on the pristine concrete steps and watched the federal vehicles flash their bright red and blue lights as they pulled out into the busy city traffic, carrying the venomous remnants of my past away forever. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of lingering familial guilt. They had meticulously dug their own graves, fueled by pure, unadulterated arrogance and a profound, fatal underestimation of my intellect. They had foolishly assumed I would quietly accept my designated role as their silent sacrificial lamb. Instead, I had methodically orchestrated their complete and utter destruction, using nothing but the flawless logic of my code and the impenetrable, crushing strength of the law. The dark reign of their fraudulent, abusive empire was permanently over, completely eradicated from the face of the earth. The San Francisco wind whipped around me, carrying the sharp, salty scent of the Pacific Ocean. I stood at the very edge of the monolithic glass and steel structure that now housed the Nemesis Tech Research Institute. 6 months had passed since the boardroom doors locked behind my shattered biological family. I rested my hands on the pristine glass railing of my private rooftop terrace, looking down at the glittering, sprawling grid of the city. I was exactly 33 years old, and I was looking at a kingdom I had built entirely with my own intellect. The contrast between this breathtaking altitude and the suffocating windowless basement of my parents' old house was absolute. For 7 years, I had stared at a damp concrete wall, typing lines of complex biological code while they drained the company accounts to fund their lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. Tonight, I was standing on top of the world, hosting an exclusive appreciation gala for the brilliant minds who were currently advancing global medicine using my uncompromised artificial intelligence architecture. Inside the luxurious penthouse reception area behind me, soft jazz music floated through the air. Waiters carried silver trays of vintage champagne and artisan hors d'oeuvres to the most powerful investors, scientists, and legal minds in the biotechnology sector. They were not here to celebrate a loud, incompetent sales executive. They were here to honor me. My smartphone vibrated softly inside the pocket of my tailored emerald evening gown. I pulled the device out and glanced at the glowing screen. A text message had just arrived from a completely unknown, unregistered number. I did not recognize the local area code, which usually indicated a prepaid disposable cellular phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the message thread with a calm, analytical curiosity. The block of text was incredibly long, filled with desperate grammatical errors and frantic, erratic capitalization. I read the words with cold, clinical detachment. Gemma, please do not ignore this message. It is your mother. I had to buy a cheap prepaid phone from a convenience store because the federal authorities confiscated all our devices and shut down our cellular plans. We have absolutely nothing left. The government seized the estate, the cars, the offshore accounts, and every single piece of jewelry I owned to pay the massive restitution fines to Horizon Pharma. Brent was denied bail. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in a maximum security federal facility for corporate espionage. He cries every time I visit him. Your father survived the heart attack, but the hospital discharged him with a massive stack of medical bills we cannot possibly pay. We are currently living in a filthy weekly motel on the absolute worst edge of Oakland. Richard needs expensive cardiac medication and intensive physical therapy just to walk to the bathroom. His heart is failing. We are starving, Gemma. I am begging you on my hands and knees. You have billions of dollars now. Please just wire us $50,000 or $10,000. Just enough to buy his medication and get us out of this horrific motel. We are your family. You cannot just leave us here to die in the gutter. Please have mercy on your own parents. I stood perfectly still on the rooftop terrace, letting the cold wind rush past my face. I read the pathetic, crawling message a second time. 6 months ago, receiving a message like this might have triggered a slight tremor in my hands. A lifetime of deep psychological conditioning might have forced a tiny involuntary sliver of unearned guilt into my chest. I might have felt the oppressive heavy chain of biological obligation attempting to drag me back down into their toxic, abusive orbit. But tonight, standing under the bright California stars, I felt absolutely nothing. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. My breathing was completely calm and measured. The message did not evoke anger, sadness, or even a fleeting sense of vindictive joy. It simply registered as a highly irrelevant piece of spam data, a useless anomaly generated by a defunct system I had permanently deleted from my life. Patricia was not asking for forgiveness. She was not apologizing for spending 33 years treating my brilliant mind like a disposable commodity. She was not showing a single ounce of genuine remorse for sitting in a boardroom and actively attempting to have me committed to a psychiatric ward so she could steal a $2 billion fortune. She was simply a desperate, manipulative parasite looking for a new host to drain. She mentioned mercy. The sheer blinding audacity of that specific word was the only thing that brought a genuine, peaceful smile to my lips. They had shown absolutely zero mercy when they ordered armed security guards to throw me out onto the street with my belongings stuffed into a cardboard box. They had shown zero mercy when they froze my bank accounts and attempted to starve me into permanent submission. They had ruthlessly written the rules of engagement. I simply executed the final commands of their own highly destructive program. I did not type a reply. Explaining my total indifference to a woman who possessed zero capacity for self-reflection was a monumental waste of my cognitive energy. I simply tapped the screen and selected the message thread. I hit the delete button, watching the desperate weeping text vanish entirely into the digital void. Then with a slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying motion, I selected the unknown number and added it to my permanent block list. The digital cord was finally undeniably and permanently severed. They were officially ghosts haunting a miserable, impoverished reality of their own creation. I placed the phone back into my pocket and turned away from the edge of the roof. I walked toward the heavy glass doors leading back into the vibrant, brightly lit penthouse. As I stepped over the threshold, the warm air of the gala washed over me. Sylvia immediately caught my eye from across the room. My brilliant, ruthless intellectual property attorney raised her crystal champagne flute in my direction, a sharp, knowing smile playing on her lips. She understood exactly what it took to conquer an empire. Donovan stepped away from a group of elite international investors and walked directly toward me. The chief executive officer of Horizon Pharma extended a glass of champagne, his expression radiating absolute professional respect. He did not see me as a fragile daughter or a background asset. He saw me as a titan. "We just received the preliminary data from the European clinical trials," Donovan said, his voice buzzing with genuine excitement. "Your predictive algorithms are currently outperforming our most optimistic financial projections by 40%. The board of directors is absolutely thrilled, Gemma. You have single-handedly revolutionized the entire pharmaceutical landscape." I took the champagne glass from his hand, the cool crystal feeling perfectly solid and secure in my grip. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the brilliant scientists, the aggressive legal minds, and the powerful investors who had gathered specifically to celebrate my vision. This was my true family. This was a community built entirely on mutual respect, undeniable talent, and the absolute recognition of actual tangible worth. I raised my glass, meeting Donovan's gaze with a calm, unwavering certainty. "We are just getting started, Donovan. The foundational architecture is perfectly stable now. We have successfully removed all the inefficient toxic variables from the equation. The future is completely ours to write." I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the vintage champagne. I was 33 years old. I was the sole undisputed sovereign of a multi-billion-dollar biotechnology empire. I had survived the darkest, most abusive shadows my family could construct, and I had emerged entirely unbroken, completely untouchable, and infinitely powerful. I had finally claimed my rightful place in the sun, and I would never, under any circumstances, allow anyone to turn off the lights ever again. The story of Gemma teaches us a profound and uncomfortable truth about toxic family dynamics. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, respect, or love. For years, she allowed her family to exploit her brilliant mind, while they showered praise and resources on an incompetent golden child. We often accept unacceptable behavior from our relatives because society conditions us to believe that family is everything. But when love is entirely conditional and based solely on what they can extract from you, it ceases to be love. It becomes a predatory transaction. The ultimate lesson here is the absolute necessity of self-preservation and establishing impenetrable boundaries. Gemma did not survive her betrayal by hoping her family would suddenly develop a conscience or by begging for their approval. She survived because she knew her intrinsic value and took concrete legal and strategic steps to protect her intellectual property long before the crisis occurred. She built an undeniable safety net of facts and leverage. When you are dealing with narcissistic or exploitative individuals, emotional appeals will always fail. The only language they truly understand is absolute power and natural consequences. True empowerment comes from walking away from the people who desperately try to keep you in the dark. It is about recognizing that your worth is never defined by those who constantly underestimate you for their own benefit. Sometimes the most profound healing happens not through tearful reconciliation, but through a clean, permanent severance from abuse. You have the absolute right to define your own success and to build a chosen family based on mutual respect, genuine appreciation, and authentic connection, rather than forced biological obligation. Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries to protect your worth from toxic family members? And how did it transform your life? Share your experiences in the comments below, and please subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience, independence, and reclaiming your absolute power.